Chapter 1300. He asked the treasurer, "Senior, may I ask what the third round of the test is? What are the chances of that fellow cultivator passing the test?" The level 9 treasurer replied calmly, "Do you think I'll tell you the content of the test? However, I can tell you that the chances of that person passing the test are 0. Thank you, Senior." Luo Fan would be satisfied if he could answer either one of the two questions. Therefore, he didn't mind the level 9 divine treasure saying that it wouldn't tell him the content of the test. He thanked the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure respectfully. After thanking it, Luo Fan did not return to his original position. Instead, he sat cross-legged and began the process that had lasted for a long time. He continuously guided the Buddha's light into the halo behind his head, allowing the halo to be tempered again and again, making the halo's power stronger and stronger. The process of tempering the halo was not a simple one. It was not a process that could be completed in a short period of time. The process of Luo Fan continuously guiding the Buddha's light into the aperture on this platform lasted for more than half a year, but he still didn't feel that the aperture had been raised to its limit. He still felt that the aperture was still improving at every moment. Compared to half a year ago, the power of the halo had increased by several times. He could even imagine that if he were to encounter the level 6 pseudo-sage now, it would only take a beam of light to kill him. He would be able to force the level 6 pseudo-sage to either break free of the 4 worlds or directly enter the third round of the test. However, there was no need for him to use words or attitude to force it. What a pity! Luo Fan sighed secretly. It was a pity that he did not expect the halo to have such potential half a year ago. He did not expect it to be able to improve to such an extent. If he had known this would happen, he would not have made a move in the first place. After all, the longer he delayed, the more powerful he would be, and the more terrifying his advantage would be. Just as Luo Fan was sighing to himself, the platform suddenly shone brightly. Following that, another figure appeared on the platform. As soon as this figure appeared, he naturally exuded an extremely powerful and shocking aura, as well as an extremely powerful momentum. Even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel an inexplicable chill in the face of such an aura. Luo Fan looked toward the source of the aura, and his expression changed. This person, it was none other than the strongest level 7 pseudo-sage cultivator among the cultivators who had participated in the test. At this moment, there were 4 basketball-sized, crystal-clear spheres of different colors rotating slowly around the level 7 pseudo-sage. Within these 4 translucent spheres, there seemed to be countless strange things undergoing some kind of complicated evolution. It was as if there were 4 worlds. It was obvious that these 4 spheres were the same. This was what the level 7 pseudo-sage needed to pass the second round of the test. The way these 4 spheres swam around the level 7 pseudo-divine was extremely strange. It was as if they were the complete opposite of the level 7 pseudo-divine. It was as if they were mutually exclusive and repelled each other as they swam around the level 7 pseudo-divine. As they swam around the level 7 pseudo-divine, they revealed some kind of intimacy, but also seemed to be extremely repelling each other. It was as if they were ready to escape at any moment. What an eye-opener. I thought I was the only one who passed the test in this way. I didn't expect that the level 6 pseudo-divine and now this level 7 pseudo-divine to pass the test in a different way. Luo Fan looked at the level 7 pseudo-divine and couldn't help but sigh. The level 7 pseudo-divine's method of passing the test was obviously not the same as Luo Fan's. It was impossible for him to use 4 basic existences to replace each other to build 4 worlds like Luo Fan. If that was the case, the 4 worlds would definitely be like the 4 halos behind Luo Fan's head, completely integrated with him. Even if they weren't in the form of halos, they would definitely exist in another form. Now that he was in the form of a sphere, he appeared to be both intimate and repulsive at the same time. Clearly, the method he used was different from Luo Fan's. Of course, it was also different from the method used by the 6th grade pseudo-saint. However, Compared to the method used by the level 6 pseudo-sage, the method used by the level 7 pseudo-sage was much more complicated. Luo Fan couldn't figure out what kind of method was used to cause such a situation. How could the level 7 pseudo-divine not notice after being stared at by Luo Fan for so long? His eyes flashed, and his gaze fell on Luo Fan. I know you. You passed the test before me last time. You even had killing intent towards me. The level 7 pseudo-divine said indifferently. He didn't hide his words at all. Although his expression was indifferent, an extremely cold, killing intent flashed in his eyes. Luo Fan frowned. He didn't expect that the killing intent he had towards him at the last moment on the platform would be felt by the level 7 pseudo-divine. He couldn't help but feel helpless in his heart. He originally didn't have the intention to fight against this level 7 pseudo-divine. After all, although the method this level 7 pseudo-divine used to pass the second round of the test might be different from his, it didn't seem to be too much of a shortcut. He didn't need to spend too much power to suppress the four worlds, and the strength he could exert now was obviously much stronger than the level 6 pseudo-divine. In other words, he didn't have absolute confidence in winning against this person. But now it seemed that even if he didn't want to fight, the level 7 pseudo-divine would not think the same way. It seemed that it was impossible for the two of them to reconcile. I can participate in the third round of the test at any time. Suddenly, the level 7 pseudo-divine uttered. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and instantly understood. It turned out that the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure seemed to be talking to him, but in fact, it didn't really transmit its voice. Instead, it used a special method to send its voice into his ears and even into his heart. It was just that the method used by the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure was too ingenious. It was so ingenious that Luo Fan couldn't discover it all, so he misunderstood. He thought that the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure was really speaking. After understanding this, he now also knew that when the level 7 pseudo-divine was talking to him just now, he also divided his attention to communicate with the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure and understood how to participate in the third round of the test. At the same time, he also understood why the level 6 pseudo-divine knew that he could participate in the third round of the test at any time without asking. He originally thought that he had already experienced the test 10 trillion years ago and didn't need to ask. Now it seemed that when he entered the platform, the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure had already told him the rules. The level 7 pseudo-divine looked at Luo Fan, and the killing intent in his eyes gradually calmed down. This is not the place to fight. I'll explain it to you after the test. The level 7 pseudo-divine said indifferently. Luo Fan instantly knew what he was thinking. The killing intent that the level 7 pseudo-divine had previously was obviously not fake. He really wanted to kill him and completely erase him. Judging from his appearance just now, he was almost about to make a move. The reason why he changed his mind in the next moment, the reason why he planned to wait until the test was over was even simpler. It was because he communicated with the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure and knew that as long as he willed it, he could participate in the third round of the test and disappear from this platform, avoiding everything on this platform. Obviously, for the level 7 pseudo-divine treasure. This meant that as long as he couldn't stop Luo Fan's thoughts, then even if he forced Luo Fan into a dead end, he could still easily escape from that dead end situation, this kind of situation. Of course, he wouldn't be satisfied. After understanding this, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh to himself. It seems that there's really no way to be kind. With that said, he didn't retreat just because the level 7 pseudo-divine did not make a move. Instead, he raised his hand and the 4 halos behind his head rotated. A beam of light shot out from them and directly blasted towards the level 7 pseudo-divine treasure. This beam of light was many times more powerful than the beam of light he had shot at the level 6 pseudo-sage. It directly penetrated time, space, and everything on the platform. As if it had just been born, it directly appeared above the head of the level 7 pseudo-sage and blasted straight at his head. The environment on this platform was too good for Luo Fan. Not only was the opponent's strength limited, but he was also able to escape from the battlefield at any time. He could escape from certain death attacks at any time, and it was almost impossible for his life to be endangered with such good conditions. If he didn't take this opportunity to test the strength of the level 7 pseudo divine treasure and make things difficult for him, when would he wait? Although the level 7 pseudo divine treasure did not expect Luo Fan to dare to make a move, his reaction speed was still extremely fast. In an instant, he sneered and opened his mouth. A sound wave suddenly rushed out from his mouth and instantly turned into a boundless world in front of him. It directly swallowed the beam of light emitted by the halos. The world formed by the sound wave looked like a thin layer on the outside, forming a sound curtain in front of the level 7 pseudo divine treasure. But inside, it was an almost boundless universe. It was unknown how many billions of light years worth of space existed. Although the light curtain emitted by the halos behind Luo Fan's head was extremely fast, it still took some time to penetrate this void that had billions of light years worth of space. Even if it was only a very short period of time, it was enough for powerful existences like Luo Fan and the level 7 pseudo divine treasure to deal with it in countless ways. The level 7 pseudo divine treasure raised his hand gently, and the 4 basketball-sized world around him formed a circle in front of him, surrounding the beam of light in the middle. Then, it suddenly turned and shook, producing a terrifying distortion force that instantly distorted the beam of light into a strange shape. It suddenly turned back. At the same time, the level 7 pseudo divine treasure was sent forward and appeared in front of the 4 worlds. Then, the level 7 pseudo divine treasure disappeared, and the beam of light reappeared. It followed the direction of the distortion and blasted towards Luo Fan. The 4 spheres were 4 worlds. Although they were much inferior to the 4 halos behind Luo Fan's head in essence, they were of the same kind. Under such circumstances, the power produced by the 4 spheres could naturally affect the beam of light produced by the halos and reverse it. Although it was exaggerated, it was not unimaginable. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. He raised his hand, and the beam of light gently poured into the 4 halos. It did not cause any harm to him at all. The level 7 pseudo divine treasure's expression suddenly changed when he saw that the beam of light that he had worked so hard to reverse did not affect Yishiwen at all. You actually have such a high degree of integration with the 4 worlds. It seems that I have underestimated you. The level 7 pseudo divine treasure said. The beam of light was the attack of the 4 worlds. For a level 7 pseudo sage, he could also launch such an attack with the help of the 4 worlds, but it would be like shooting a bullet from a pistol. After shooting, he might be able to control the weakness of the bullet with his own means. However, it was impossible to reload the bullet, and now Luo Fan swallowed the beam of light back into the halos without causing any harm to himself. The beam of light was clearly no longer a bullet fired from a handgun, but a fist. Obviously, it was almost impossible to reload a bullet that had been fired from a pistol, but he had to take back a fist that had been thrown out. That was extremely simple, and being able to use the worlds as his own arms and fists meant that his degree of integration with the 4 worlds had reached the level of integration. That degree of integration was enough to shock the level 7 pseudo divine treasure. Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not reply. He raised his hand again, and the 4 halos behind his head shone at the same time. They condensed into a figure in front of him and directly pounced towards the level 7 pseudo divine treasure. This figure formed by light was extremely solid. It was extremely pure, and the light emitted from it even caused the surrounding time and space to distort inexplicably. It was as if it was being distorted and assimilated by this light. And the appearance of this light figure was even more vivid. It was Luo Fan's appearance. It was detailed to the finest detail, and the finest detail was revealed. The speed of this figure was even faster than Luo Fan himself. Like a beam of light, It directly appeared around the level 7 pseudo divine treasure and blasted a fist towards the level 7 pseudo divine treasure's head. The power of this punch even shattered time and space. Although it did not affect anything on the platform, the aftermath swept out of the platform and twisted the time and space outside the platform into a gray mess. From this, it could be seen how terrifying and shocking the power of this punch was. However, in the face of such a punch, the level 7 pseudo divine treasure did not panic at all. He sneered and blasted out a punch in a way that was completely different from the figure's, but at the same speed, it collided with the figure's fist. In an instant, a terrifying shockwave spread out from the point of contact. The ripples swept through the void. Nothing on the platform had changed, but the void within a radius of an unknown number of millions of miles had undergone endless changes. Not only did it turn into gray chaos, but it also formed countless cycles of life and death. Countless worlds were born in an instant and completely destroyed in an instant. This cycle of birth and destruction happened billions of times in a breath's time. Amidst this impact, the figure condensed from the halo behind Luo Fan's head was instantly blasted into a ball of light, a ball of cloud-like light. Obviously, it had suffered great damage. In contrast, the level 7 pseudo divine treasure's performance was much better. He only paled slightly before recovering. The level 7 pseudo divine treasure was simply too powerful. Even though his strength had been greatly restricted, and even though Luo Fan was using the power of the four worlds, he was still no match for the level 7 pseudo divine treasure. However, in contrast, Luo Fan was only using the power of the four worlds after all. The damage to the power did not affect him much. On the other hand, although the level 7 pseudo divine treasure was powerful, it was using its own power. Once it was damaged, it would be damaged as well. In this way, it seemed that Luo Fan had the upper hand in this impact. Luo Fan's reaction speed was quite fast. When he felt the figure of light being blasted apart, he raised his hand and a beam of light rushed out from the halos behind his head. It seemed to transcend time and space and blasted into the cloud-like light. As the beam of light entered, it directly distorted and transformed into a figure. It was a figure that looked exactly the same as the previous figure of light, but more condensed and real. At the same time, its aura was stronger and more terrifying. After this figure appeared, he raised his hand and blasted another punch at the level 7 pseudo divine treasure. The power of this punch was even stronger than the previous one. The fluctuations it produced swept through the space-time outside the platform, causing the space-time that was evolving with the birth and destruction of billions of worlds to instantly calm down. The process of all the worlds reincarnating and evolving completely disappeared, turning into an indescribably terrifying chaos again. This time, the level 7 pseudo divine treasure did not intend to take it head-on. Although the impact just now did not cause any real damage to him, it had made him sober up. Even if he did not suffer any real damage each time, he would still be at a disadvantage if it continued to accumulate at the critical moment. His figure flashed, and he turned behind the figure. He opened his mouth and shouted. A sound wave whirled instantly enveloped the figure, and he disappeared from the platform in an instant. Chapter 1301. That world was so vast and stable that even if the light figure was extremely powerful and could even injure the level 7 pseudo-sage, it was not that easy to break it. At the very least, it would take some time to do it. The level 7 pseudo-sage took advantage of this opportunity to raise his hand and slap the soundwave world. With a soft poof, that incomparably complete, vast, and stable soundwave world completely collapsed and shattered in an instant. The destructive power produced by the collapse of this world was terrifying beyond imagination. In an instant, the glowing human figure was smashed into pieces and turned into a cloud of light that reappeared. However, it could not withstand the terrifying impact caused by the collapse of the soundwave world and collapsed together with the world. Fortunately, although this world of sound waves was powerful, After all, it was only a world created by a rank 7 pseudo-saint cultivator. No matter how powerful and stable it was, there was no way it could compare to a natural world. Although the destructive power was terrifying, it couldn't completely erase that figure of light from its roots. In the end, although the light figure collapsed, it only turned into a cloud of light that could recover at any time. However, it seemed to be enough for the level 7 pseudo-sage. He took advantage of this opportunity to directly appear in front of Luo Fan and raise his hand to slap at Luo Fan. In an instant, an invisible world appeared out of thin air in front of his palm. It directly wrapped around Luo Fan, tried to absorb him along with the 4 halos behind him, which were the 4 worlds. Faced with this change, Luo Fan's expression changed. The speed of the entire process was so fast that it almost exceeded the limit of his reaction. He had just turned the light cloud back into a human figure and attacked the level 7 pseudo-sage. Suddenly, a soundwave world appeared and enveloped the figure. Then, the soundwave world collapsed, and his light figure turned back into a light cloud. Following, almost at the same time, the level 7 pseudo-sage figure appeared in front of him, and an invisible world wrapped around him. All of this happened in almost an instant. How could it be so easy to react? Instinctively, Luo Fan activated the halos behind his head. In an instant, the 4 halos abruptly shuddered before suddenly rotating to form a sphere. It wrapped around him and suddenly swelled up. With a rush, it instantly broke through the invisible world that was wrapping around him. At this point, incomparably terrifying sounds rang out from all over the place, interweaving together and engulfing the entire platform. Of course, such a sound wave couldn't be stronger than the shock wave from before. It couldn't affect everything on the platform. Therefore, nothing on the platform changed in the face of the commotion. However, even if there were no changes on the platform, it did not mean that there were no changes outside the platform. In an instant, the extremely chaotic state outside the platform was added to the fire. Endless sound waves produced all sorts of terrifying changes that attached to the gray existence. It was as if invisible worlds were being created out of thin air on the platform. All kinds of strange things were born there, and they were destroyed there. At this time, Luo Fan also reacted. He narrowed his eyes, and the 4 halos that had turned into spheres to protect him fluctuated slightly. Endless light was emitted from them. The light condensed into a substance. After leaving the halos, it condensed into countless 5-clawed, divine dragons in the void. They bared their fangs and brandished their claws at the level 7 pseudo-sage from all directions. At the same time, in the distance, the cloud-like light where the level 7 pseudo-sage was originally had suddenly condensed. This time, it did not turn into a human figure, but a palm. It stretched out from that position and directly grabbed at the level 7 pseudo-sage across a long distance. This large radiant hand had even affected the surrounding Buddha light, causing the Buddha light to make way for it. Such a change might not be considered much in other places, but on this platform, which no matter how strong the shockwaves were, they could not affect it in the slightest. It was enough to show how powerful and terrifying the power of this giant radiant hand was. Whether it was the 5-clawed divine dragons or the light palm, they all seemed to have surpassed time and space. By the time Luo Fan reacted, he had already arrived at the side of the level 7 pseudo-sage and blasted it at the ladder. The level 7 pseudo-sage frowned. However, his frown was not because of the surrounding light dragons that were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws at him, nor was it because of the light palm that was coming at him from behind. Instead, it was because of the 4 halos that had turned into spheres around Luo Fan's body. These 4 halos were formed by 4 strange worlds. Among them were the 4 test certificates. Although their levels were not as high as the Devil Realm and Earth's universe, they were much stronger than ordinary vast thousand realms. These 4 worlds had turned into halos to protect the person in front of him. If he wanted to attack this person, he would need to break these halos. In order to break these halos, he would need to break these 4 worlds at the same time. However, These four worlds were much more advanced than the vast Thousand Realms. If he was at his absolute peak, it would take him a long time to break them. Moreover, most of his strength was being held back by the four world around him, so he could not unleash his full strength. If he wanted to break these four worlds, it would take a long time. If he added the control of this level to Pseudo-Sage, it would be almost impossible. Faced with a slight attack from him, the other party would lose the ability to resist or even be completely wiped out. However, because of this layer of light, he could not hurt him. This kind of feeling, to him, was obviously an extremely aggrieved existence. He casually waved his hand around his body. A vast and boundless world appeared around him. Although this world was boundless, it looked like a thin film on the outside. However, it did not take up much space. This layer of film-like world was tightly attached to the body of the level 7 Pseudo-Sage, completely protecting him. It was also at this moment that the countless light attacks that Luo Fan had released had already hit his body and rushed into the world. There was no trace of them at all, as if they had never appeared. Luo Fan also frowned slightly at this moment. Through his perception of the light, he clearly knew that the world that the light had rushed into was unimaginably vast. Even though he knew that this world was only a thin layer from the outside world, no matter how he searched, he still couldn't find it. Through his perception of the light, he could not find the edge. No matter how he crossed the void and broke space-time, he could not rush out of this world and break through the level 7 Pseudo-Sage that was wrapped in the center of this world. As expected of a level 7 Pseudo-Sage. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. This was the level 7 Pseudo-Sage's use of the world. He had truly reached the acme of perfection. Sound waves open up the world, power open up the world, shock waves open up the world, and so on. Not only were there many kinds of them, but their speed was also unimaginably fast, which really opened his eyes. Just like the level 7 Pseudo-Sage was troubled by the halos around his body, Luo Fan was also helpless about the level 7 Pseudo-Sage's ability to open up the world. The level 7 Pseudo-Sage could not break the halos to hurt him, and he actually could not find a way to break through the level 7 Pseudo-Sage world to attack his body. The level 7 Pseudo-Sage use of the world was really superb. He did not need to move. The layer of thin film around his body changed, and he seemed to have become transparent. The light dragons and light hands were directly changed by the thin film, bypassing his body and rushing out from the other direction where they had rushed into before. It was as if he did not exist at all. Luo Fan sighed and withdrew the countless light into the halos helplessly. Although he could clearly feel that the level 7 Pseudo-Sage had used some kind of method to change the direction of the light and send it out of the world, he could not stop this method at all. He could not stop the level 7 Pseudo-Sage from bypassing his attack at all. Under such circumstances, even if he continued to attack, he would only be humiliating himself. It would not have any effect at all. It was better to withdraw his power. The level 7 Pseudo-Sage suddenly said, "A mere level 2 Pseudo-Sage can actually use the four worlds to this extent. You are very talented." At this time, his expression had already returned to calmness, and the killing intent in his eyes had unknowingly weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. Obviously, Luo Fan's performance had already been recognized by him. As a level 7 Pseudo-Sage, this person had already cultivated for trillions of years. He had already seen through the vicissitudes of life, and his mind had been tempered to an incredible height by the endless years. Under such circumstances, he rather admired Luo Fan, who was able to use a method to make him unable to find a way to deal with him. He vaguely admitted that Luo Fan had the qualifications to have malice towards him. To him, those who had strength were qualified to have malice towards others. Without strength, one had no right to have malice towards others. Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, "Your method of using the world is really superb and admirable." To Luo Fan, praising others was not a big deal at all. Even if the person in front of him was still an enemy, he would not be stingy in praising the other party's strength. The level 7 Pseudo-Sage smiled faintly and did not speak anymore. He turned around and took a step forward. His figure directly crossed the void and came directly to where he was originally. He floated in the Buddhist light and began to guide the Buddhist light to constantly wash the four worlds. Since Luo Fan could discover the magical effect of the Buddhist light, this level, 7 pseudo-sage naturally would also discover it. Luo Fan shrugged and did not take it to heart. The level, 7 pseudo-sage's actions clearly showed his attitude. He could not deal with Luo Fan now, but he would not give up the idea of finding trouble with him after he got out. Understanding this, Luo Fan did not have any fear in his heart. He had even defeated a level 8 pseudo-sage once and escaped from a level 9 pseudo-sage more than once. Under such circumstances, although he was a little vigilant against a level 7 pseudo-sage, he was not to the point of being afraid. If this level 7 pseudo-sage did not want to deal with him, that would naturally be the best. However, if the level 7 pseudo-sage wanted to find trouble with him, he would not be too worried. At most, he would just deal with it when it came. His mentality was quite calm. Senior, will the third round of the test be life-threatening? Luo Fan suddenly thought of something and asked the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure in his heart. He believed that since the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure could send its voice into his heart, it would naturally be able to hear his thoughts. Sure enough, just after he asked this in his heart, the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure sounded like it was speaking. It entered his ears, or rather into his heart. No round of the test can guarantee the safety of the person being tested. However, it will not threaten the person's life either. Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed. He knew that the hope that this level 7 pseudo-sage treasure would fail in the third round of the test had been dashed. The words of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure were very clear. The third round of the test was actually the same as the first 2 rounds of the test. It was also a test of a certain ability of the cultivator. All the methods were chosen by the cultivator themselves. If the cultivator courted death, he would really die. However, if the cultivator did not courted death, there would not be any rule of death in the third round of the test. Any cultivator absolutely cherished their own life. Even if there was a chance to become a sage in the end, no cultivator would be willing to gamble their life for such an inheritance test. Therefore, it was obviously unrealistic to hope that the level 7 pseudo-sage treasure would die in the third round of the test. Luo Fan sighed secretly. He no longer cared about anything else and began to constantly guide the surrounding Buddha light into the spherical halo of light around his body. Turning the halo of light into a sphere to protect himself was something that Luo Fan had never thought of changing. The reason why he could make the level 7 pseudo-sage unable to attack him, and the reason why the level 7 pseudo-sage could only retreat helplessly was because of the halo of light protecting him. Under such circumstances, if he did not use the halo of light to protect himself and instead placed it behind his head like before, it would obviously be luring the level 7 pseudo-sage to change his mind and attack him. This was obviously looking for trouble for himself. It could even be said that he was courting death. Of course, Luo Fan would not make such a choice. Even though the level 7 pseudo-sage was much stronger than Luo Fan, he still did not disperse the thin layer of world around him. Could it be that Luo Fan was still confident that he was stronger than the level 7 pseudo-sage? As the Buddha light continued to rush into the 4 halos, the light of the 4 halos became purer and more condensed. The 4 worlds inside the 4 halos also became stronger and more mysterious. There were even traces of strange existences constantly overflowing from the 4 halos during this process. Such a change attracted the attention of the level 7 pseudo-sage, causing him to frown again. However, he only frowned slightly. He could not deal with Luo Fan at all now, so even if he made a move, it would be useless. As a level 7 pseudo-sage, he naturally would not make a useless move. However, although he did not make a move, he accelerated the process of guiding the Buddha light into the 4 basketball-sized spheres. As the Buddha light poured into them, the 4 worlds became more and more crystal clear, and the size of the spheres gradually shrank. It seemed that in the process of being washed by the Buddha light, the four spheres were constantly condensing and strengthening. Time passed slowly as the two of them washed the worlds with the help of the Buddha light. In the blink of an eye, 3 years had passed. During these 3 years, not a single cultivator had come to this platform. Even the level 6 pseudo-sage who had participated in the third round of the test couldn't be found. It was unknown whether he was still in the test or had been sent away after failing the test. On this day, Luo Fan's body trembled, and there was suddenly an inexplicable sense of perfection coming from the four halos. This sense of perfection made Luo Fan slightly stunned. He suddenly opened his eyes and couldn't help but smile faintly. It turned out that the four halos had become almost transparent. Even though they still turned into spheres and wrapped around his body, they seemed almost non-existent at first glance, making people feel that the light and shadow around Luo Fan's body seemed to be a little distorted. At this moment, Luo Fan knew that the four worlds had been tempered to the limit by the Buddha light. They had been raised to the limit. Next, no matter how much Buddha light washed over them, it would no longer be able to make the four halos improve. Of course, at the same time, this also meant that the power of the four halos had increased by another level. How could Luo Fan not feel happy when he understood this? With a slight jolt of his heart, he felt an incomparably powerful feeling coming from the halos. His body, which was wrapped by the halos, had an indescribable sense of security. It was as if the destructive force produced by the destruction of the universe could not break through the halos and hurt his body. This feeling was incomparably wonderful. With a jolt of his heart, he turned his head and looked at the level 7 pseudo-sage in the distance. The four spheres floating around the level 7 pseudo-sage body had now become the size of a fist, more than 10 times smaller than the size of basketball. Moreover, the four balls were even more crystalline and translucent than before. Chapter 1302. The level 7 pseudo-sage's eyesight was amazing. Seeing the difference between Luo Fan's current appearance and his previous appearance, he could naturally tell how much progress he had made. In just a few short years, he had refined the four worlds to such a level. It was simply to the point where they were completely compatible with him. Under normal circumstances, he might not be able to make such progress even after tens of thousands of years, let alone a few years. How could he not be shocked? Luo Fan did not care about his shock. He smiled at the level 7 pseudo-divine, and then his figure flickered as he stepped forward. In an instant, he crossed a long distance and arrived in front of the level 7 pseudo-divine. Then, he raised his hand and condensed a powerful force in his hand. Then, he punched forward through his fist. This time, there was no dazzling radiance or any special movement. It was just a simple punch that was sent forward. However, facing this punch, the level 7 pseudo-sage showed an unprecedented look of nervousness. He raised his hand and also punched toward Luo Fan's punch. Their fists collided in an instant. From the looks of it, it looked like a battle between ordinary martial artists. However, that was obviously only on the surface. On a deeper level, countless mysterious changes beyond the imagination of all living beings were condensed in the process of the two fists colliding. The level 7 pseudo-sage looked like he had only thrown out a punch, but in fact, it was not a punch at all. It was clearly an unknown number of worlds. Each of these worlds was extremely vast. They were extremely powerful, and there were even countless living beings in them. There were many such worlds. Under this punch, all the power was condensed in one place, and all the force was converted into a direction that was directed toward the direction of Luo Fan's punch. There was naturally no need to mention how powerful such a punch was. Similarly, Luo Fan's punch was not an ordinary punch either. His punch, he condensed the terrifying power of the four worlds that had turned into colorless and transparent rings of light revolving around his body. Compared to the punch of the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse that contained countless worlds, this power was only the combination of the power of four worlds. However, due to the uniqueness of the four worlds and the fact that the four worlds represented the four basic existences of the universe, The combination of the power of the four worlds was not any weaker than the power of countless worlds. On the contrary, this power was the combination of the power of four special worlds. They complemented each other, and promoted each other, causing this power to become even purer. The effect was also even more mysterious. Compared to the gathering power of countless worlds that a level 7 pseudo-sage blasted out, this power was even more mysterious. It was even more miraculous. The instant the two collided, time seemed to have stopped, but it also seemed to have collapsed. At this moment, the terrifying shock wave swept out. The space outside the platform, which had already calmed down, was completely shattered. This time, not even the gray chaos was left behind. Everything was turned into nothingness, a nothingness that almost represented the abstract concept of nothingness. As for the time, space, matter, energy, and even the laws that represented the operation of all the laws that should have remained, they were all swept away by the impact, and no one knew where they went. Under such an impact, even Luo Fan and the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse would not be unscathed. At the moment of the collision, Luo Fan's face turned pale. He felt a terrifying impact pass through the defense of the four rings of light and enter his body. At this moment, he felt that every particle in his body was being shaken violently, and he felt like he was about to completely collapse and shatter. Fortunately, the power of his four halos was extremely mysterious. With a slight circulation, the impact that surged into his body was instantly absorbed by the four halos. The feeling that made him feel as if his entire body was about to completely collapse, be destroyed, and disappear suddenly disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. Therefore, the result of this impact was only slightly pale for Luo Fan. Compared to Luo Fan, the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse was not so lucky. At the moment of the collision, the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse's body shook, and then a visible impact was generated from his fist. It directly swept through his entire body, and the inexplicable shockwave seemed to have reached an unimaginable level. Although the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse reacted extremely quickly and used all kinds of methods to eliminate the shockwave, he still couldn't completely eliminate the impact in the end. His entire body shook, and a large amount of blood mist suddenly gushed out of the acupoints all over his body. After the blood mist left his body, it turned into a ferocious creature that pounced towards the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse, wanting to tear him apart. Obviously, this was the result of Luo Fan's attack. It had even soaked through the blood mist. In other words, the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse couldn't resolve this power, and had no choice but to pour this power into the blood mist and send it out of his body. Even innate Zenith Heaven powerhouse would mutate and evolve into some kind of creature after losing control, let alone Luo Fan's power that far surpassed the level 2 pseudo-sage powerhouse. After completely losing control, it naturally wrapped around the blood mist and turned into a ferocious creature that continued to attack the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse that Luo Fan had released. Of course, the result of the ferocious creature formed by the blood mist was obvious. Even the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse couldn't do anything to him, let alone attack him outside his body. As the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse trembled, all the creatures in the blood mist were completely dispersed and turned into nothingness, vanishing without a trace. Good move. The level 7 pseudo-sage snorted coldly. He raised his other hand in an instant and pointed directly at Luo Fan's head. Although the finger contained terrifying power, it wasn't used to attack. However, it wasn't used to attack. As he pointed his finger forward, a figure appeared in the distance. As the void changed, Luo Fan suddenly felt his entire body being pulled by an inexplicable force and falling into a certain abyss. This feeling made his heart palpitate. Although he felt like he was falling into a certain abyss, his eyes and his senses told him that he was still on the platform, facing the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse. He was still standing on the platform, facing the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse, and his fist was still pointed at the level 7 pseudo-sage powerhouse. The contradiction between this feeling and what he saw was so strange. How could he not understand that he had unknowingly fallen into a trap? With a slight thought, the halo around his body that had already turned invisible suddenly shook, and an incomparably intense light instantly burst out. In this light, everything that acted on Luo Fan's body was instantly repelled, including the Buddha's light on the platform. After being tempered by the Buddha's light for such a long time, this happy world had been tempered into a state where it had completely fused with Luo Fan. These four worlds naturally had some kind of inexplicable affinity with the Buddha's light. This kind of affinity was showing its effects at this moment. It allowed the light released by the four halos to have an effect on the Buddha's light, unlike the previous times when it had no effect on the Buddha's light at all. The moment the light expelled everything, Luo Fan felt a strange existence suddenly separated itself from his head. The moment this strange existence separated, he felt the feeling of falling into the abyss disappear completely. All his senses returned to normal. Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. He looked at the strange existence that separated from his head and found that it was actually a world. It was an extremely special, formless world. Such a world was even more illusory than dreams and illusions. After it was expelled by Luo Fan, it was like a finger floating outside the light, constantly attacking, as if it wanted to find a weak point to break through. It wanted to completely break through the light around Luo Fan's body and continue to enter his head. There's actually such a world. Luo Fan looked at this world and couldn't help but feel goosebumps. This world obviously had an effect on his will. If he had allowed this world to exist in his head for a while longer, perhaps his consciousness would have been completely devoured by that world. Even if he could sense everything in the outside world, it would be difficult for him to control his own body. The level 7 pseudo-sage suddenly spat out a large mouthful of blood. The invisible world that was like a finger also completely collapsed at the same time, turning into nothingness. Seeing this, Luo Fan suddenly came to a realization. Such a world was not something that a level 7 pseudo-sage could casually use, nor could it be abandoned casually. If this world was damaged, it would definitely cause a great backlash to him and bring him great harm. Understanding this, Luo Fan was slightly relieved, and, at the same time, he became even more interested in that world. What kind of world was so amazing that even a level 7 pseudo-sage had to pay a great price to use it? He was originally an expert in opening up worlds. Even he himself had probably forgotten how many worlds he had opened up. Not long ago, he even used a special method to open up 4 special worlds that he didn't dare to imagine before. He could even say that he was the most familiar with opening up worlds. However, at this moment, he discovered that this level 7 pseudo-sage in front of him could actually open up a world that he didn't understand at all and could only open up at a great price. To him, this was really like a gourmet who had an extremely delicious dish in front of him, but he couldn't tell how it was made. One could imagine how tempting it was. What world is this? Luo Fan asked instinctively. The level 7 pseudo-sage frowned, and the way he looked at Luo Fan suddenly became a little strange. This is an unintentional world. However, he was quite generous and actually answered Luo Fan's question and told Luo Fan about the world he had opened up. Of course, at the same time, he stepped back slightly, took a few deep breaths, and the power in his body surged. He had already recovered from the many injuries he had suffered before. Even the backlash caused by the expulsion of the unintentional world had been completely suppressed by him. After all, he was a level 7 pseudo-sage. His control of his body and power was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare with. Even if his body was completely destroyed, he could reform it in an instant, let alone some injuries. Of course, this was also related to the fact that these injuries were not serious. If it was really an injury that damaged the origin, let alone a level 7 pseudo-sage, even a level 9 pseudo-sage, or possibly even a sage, would need a very long time to recover. There was no doubt about this. Unintentional world? What world is this? Countless thoughts flashed in Luo Fan's mind, and he seemed to have thought of something, but he was more confused and confused. Obviously, he didn't know what kind of world this unintentional world was. Logically speaking, a world that could have such a name should obviously be related to consciousness and willpower. However, this was not the world of consciousness, let alone the world of willpower. At least, in Luo Fan's understanding, the world of willpower and the world of consciousness were not like this, and there was no power that could pull the opponent's willpower into it. If you want to know, go inside. The level 7 pseudo-sage had already recovered at this time, and he only smiled coldly. He said so. Saying that, he raised his hand. Then, he slapped fiercely towards Luo Fan. The power of this slap was not strong, but it was entangled with countless strange airflows. These strange airflows appeared out of thin air. They seemed to be ordinary airflows, but they had characteristics that airflows did not have. They were like invisible ribbons, entangling the hand of the level 7 pseudo-sage. At this moment, the hand of the level 7 pseudo-sage seemed to be wearing an invisible, huge glove. Looking at this move of the level 7 pseudo-sage, Luo Fan's face showed excitement and fear. He could feel that the power of this slap was absolutely strong. The airflows around this palm seemed to be a complete and special world. Each of these worlds contained a strange characteristic, and the performance of each world seemed to be different from the world in Luo Fan's understanding. For Luo Fan, the large number of worlds almost completely subverted his understanding. It made him feel as if he had fallen into a new world, as if a new door had opened in front of him. There are actually so many forms in the world, he thought in an instant. However, although he was extremely impressed by the attainments of the level 7 pseudo-sage in opening up the world, it did not mean that he wanted to enjoy the consequences of that world slapping on his body. He could clearly feel that the destructive power of the level 7 pseudo-sage slap itself might not be strong, but the various magical effects of the many worlds might bring him considerable trouble. He could even find the shadow of the finger-shaped unintentional world in it. Therefore, in the face of this slap, Luo Fan did not dare to be negligent. The infinite light radiating from his body condensed in an instant, turning into an extremely condensed palm that was almost like the densest solid in the world. It directly blocked the slap of the level 7 pseudo-sage. The level 7 pseudo-sage frowned slightly. However, he did not change his action, and the slap continued towards Luo Fan. Pooh! With a soft sound, the palm formed by light and the slap of the level 7 pseudo-sage collided. In an instant, the palm of light was completely submerged by the airflow around the level 7 pseudo-sage palm. The moment the palm of light was submerged, Luo Fan felt that something was wrong. His will, his perception, and his mind, which was attached to the palm of light and controlling the palm of light, seemed to be torn apart by some kind of terrifying force in an instant, and were constantly thrown into an inexplicable abyss. Such a result made it difficult for the palm of light to move forward, and even the terrifying power and powerful attack contained in it could no longer be exerted. It was directly smashed by the power contained in the slap of the level 7 pseudo-sage. All the light scattered in all directions and turned into specks of light. What a strange world! Luo Fan furrowed his brows and took a deep breath. The discomfort caused by the shattering of his will, consciousness, and mind completely disappeared. The halo around his body rotated slightly at this moment, and the light spots produced by the shattered palm instantly gathered towards him from all directions, completely entering the halo. Not a single one of them was left out. After completing this step, Luo Fan let out a soft shout, and 4 beams of light rushed out of the halo. However, these 4 beams of light were not aimed at the level 7 pseudo-sage, but the 4 fist-sized spheres around the level 7 pseudo-sage body. The 4 worlds created by the level 7 pseudo-sage after passing the second round of the test. He had now discovered the key. 3 years ago, the level 7 pseudo-sage clearly did not have the means he had now, and he could not display the many special worlds so casually. However, he could actually do this now. Obviously, this was not his original strength. It could only be what he had obtained in the past 3 years. Obviously, the changes that happened to the level 7 pseudo-sage in the past 3 years were most obvious in these 4 worlds. These 4 worlds were originally the size of basketballs. Chapter 1303. Although Luo Fan was confident, it was not to the point of blinding his judgment. He knew that he could obtain benefits from those 4 worlds and rely on those 4 worlds to fight against a level 7 pseudo-sage, but it did not mean that others couldn't. Although those 4 worlds were not created by the level 7 pseudo-sage using Luo Fan's general method, and might have been created using some tricks, Luo Fan did not believe that the level 7 pseudo-sage could not obtain benefits from those 4 worlds. If the level 7 pseudo-sage could not obtain benefits from those 4 worlds, why did he work so hard to use the endless Buddha light around him to refine those 4 worlds? Why did he refine those 4 worlds from the size of basketballs to the size of fists today? In that case, it was very likely that the level 7 pseudo-sage strength had improved because of these 4 worlds. Now, it was extremely difficult for Luo Fan to defeat this level 7 pseudo-sage. Under such circumstances, he naturally needed to change his target to the source of the level 7 pseudo-sage's sudden increase in strength in the past few years. After losing those 4 worlds, the level 7 pseudo-sage might be able to exert all his strength because of the 4 worlds drag. He might even be stronger than he was now. However, once he lost these 4 worlds, according to Luo Fan's deduction, he would no longer be qualified to stay on this platform. He might be directly sent away by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, but no matter what the result was, it would not be worse than the current situation. In that case, it was easy to imagine what Luo Fan would choose. Just as the 4 beams of light blasted toward the 4 spheres, the level 7 pseudo-sage discovered his target. He could not help but change his expression. He raised his hand and waved. The 4 worlds trembled slightly and disappeared in an instant. When Luo Fan saw this, he did not feel a headache. Instead, a smile appeared on his face. The more this level 7 pseudo-sage cared about these 4 worlds, it showed that his guess was correct. With a thought, the light of the 4 halos around him turned and penetrated into the void, thoroughly checking the space on the entire platform countless times. Finally, in a strange space-time, he discovered the existence of the 4 spheres. After discovering those 4 worlds, without any hesitation, Luo Fan guided the beam of light into the space-time and continued to bombard the 4 worlds. The level 7 pseudo-sage's expression became even uglier. He didn't have time to attack Luo Fan. He raised his hand and grabbed at the void. A colorless and transparent airflow suddenly surged into that strange space-time. With an abrupt turn, a layer of mist instantly formed around the 4 worlds. In an instant, it enveloped the 4 worlds. The light beams shot out from the 4 halos directly into the smoke. In an instant, the void twisted countless times and was blocked by an unknown number of worlds. The 4 worlds that were originally close at hand suddenly seemed to become endlessly far away. Luo Fan had long expected such a change. After all, the level 7 pseudo-sage's ability to open up worlds had already reached an unimaginable level. After a few years of progress, this ability had increased a lot. Seeing that it was impossible for the 4 worlds to continue hiding, he opened up several worlds to surround them, making the distance between the 4 worlds and Luo Fan infinitely long. This was simply a certainty. In the face of this endless world, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the 4 beams of light slightly vibrated. The power that he had comprehended from the 4 halos in the past few years was instantly displayed. The 4 light beams directly derived countless worlds and collided with the world that blocked the light beams. It produced a phenomenon similar to the inevitable annihilation of matter and antimatter when they came into contact. In an instant, The worlds that blocked the 4 light beams shattered and disappeared one by one. As each world perished and shattered, the 4 beams of light moved billions of miles closer to the 4 fist-sized worlds, and so on and so forth. In just a breath's time, the 4 light beams had actually broken through the countless layers of worlds that the level 7 pseudo-sage had set up and directly blasted into the 4 worlds. The expression of the level 7 pseudo-sage became extremely ugly. How could he have imagined that Luo Fan would have such a method? A few years ago, although Luo Fan was powerful and had exquisite control over the 4 worlds, the power that the light beams gave him was not very profound. Regarding the world he had set up, he could only rely on his powerful strength to forcibly destroy it. However, after just a few years, the method that he had used to render Luo Fan helpless was no longer useful to him. Even the 4 beams of light couldn't stop him. One could well imagine how inconceivable such a situation was to him. He shouted angrily. Ignoring Luo Fan, he clapped his hands again and again, and a mysterious power crazily poured into the strange void, crazily pouring into the 4 fist-sized spheres. Those 4 worlds were suppressed by his own powerful strength, which was why they remained around him. Although the power of the light beams that Luo Fan blasted out would not cause much damage to the 4 worlds themselves, it could destroy the power that he used to suppress the 4 worlds. Therefore, if he did not care about it, the 4 worlds would very likely rebel and break out of his control. It was precisely because the 4 light beams could cause such a consequence that he was in such a hurry. He did not even have time to care about Luo Fan's main body, who was not far away. He could only continuously pour power into the 4 worlds to disintegrate the 4 light beams and strengthen the suppression of the 4 worlds, maintaining the 4 worlds under his absolute control. Luo Fan sighed secretly at this moment. No matter what the level 7 pseudo-saint did, he did not take the opportunity to attack the level 7 pseudo-saint. The moment the 4 beams of light entered the 4 worlds, he knew that the stability of the 4 worlds was much stronger than he had imagined. Unless he directly poured the 4 light beams into the 4 worlds, it would be impossible to destroy the 4 worlds. Otherwise, no matter how many light beams he poured into the 4 worlds, it would be impossible to cause any damage to the foundations of the worlds. This was what the level 7 pseudo-saint was worried about. Luo Fan also had a clear understanding of the power that he used to suppress the 4 worlds. He knew that he could shake the power in a short period of time, but it was impossible to completely destroy it. In addition, it was almost impossible for him to deal with the level 7 pseudo-saint's main body. The reason why the 4 light beams could break through the barriers of the layers of worlds and pour into the 4 worlds was that the level 7 pseudo-saint did not expect his light beams to have such a change and still use the same method from a few years ago. That was why Yishiwen was able to break it. Now that the level 7 pseudo-saint had reacted, of course he would not use such a method again. Instead, he would definitely use the method that Yishiwen had just obtained from the 4 worlds in the past few years to deal with him. In this way, Luo Fan was not confident that he could break through such a defense for the time being. In other words, he was not confident that he could really hurt the level 7 pseudo-saint's main body that was protected by many strange worlds. Since the 4 worlds could not hurt the main body, there was not much point in making a move. That was why Luo Fan stopped at this moment and did not take the opportunity to deal with the level 7 pseudo-saint. However, he did not have a mood to continue staying here. Now that his 4 light halos had been refined to the limit by the Buddha light, there would not be any improvement even if he continued to refine them. There was no need for him to stay on his platform anymore. More importantly, if the level 7 pseudo-saint recovered, he would target Yishiwen, which was obviously a very troublesome matter for him. Therefore, after Luo Fan sighed, he just smiled at the level 7 pseudo-saint and said goodbye. With that, he told the level 9 pseudo-saint treasure in his heart that he wanted to participate in the 3rd round of the test. As soon as he said that, he felt an inexplicable force enveloping him. Then, with a tremor of the force, the world around his body disappeared completely, and he gradually appeared in a strange world. On the platform, when Luo Fan said goodbye. The level 7 pseudo-saint had already completely expelled the light that had poured into the four worlds, allowing the four worlds to return to his absolute control. They returned to his body and circulated around him according to an extremely special orbit. At this time, when he heard Luo Fan's words of farewell, his expression became angry. Then, he saw Luo Fan suddenly disappear in front of him, and a terrifying force that he could not resist wrapped around Luo Fan, making him unable to even think of attacking him. While he was hesitating, Luo Fan's figure had completely disappeared in front of him, as if he had never appeared. He was the only person left on the entire platform. After standing there for a while, the anger on the level 7 pseudo-saint's face suddenly disappeared, and an inexplicable smile gradually emerged. What an interesting cultivator. I haven't met such an existence in many years. It seems that there's something to do this time. With that, he stopped guiding the Buddha light to temper his four worlds and instead called out to the level 9 pseudo-saint treasure, indicating that he wanted to participate in the third round of the test. Just as Luo Fan had expected, the method he used to pass the second round of the test was not really in line with the requirements of the level 9 pseudo-saint treasure, but a somewhat tricky method. Therefore, although he did not need to expend most of his power to suppress the four worlds that were given to him after passing the second round of the test, and he could even gain a lot of benefits from it, such as the power to create special worlds like the unintentional worlds, he was still not as good as Luo Fan, who could control those worlds at will and completely integrate with them. Under such circumstances, he continued to refine and strengthen the world. Even though he could greatly improve the world, allowing him to obtain even greater might and even more unimaginable abilities from the world, he was still unable to refine the world. However, at the same time, the improvement of the worlds would also cause him to expend more power to suppress them. As a result, he needed to expend more power to suppress the worlds in order to maintain them under his control. In this way, it would instead be a burden to his strength. Therefore, it was impossible for him to improve the four worlds without any scruples. Instead, he needed to find a balance between the strength of the worlds and his own strength, and find a degree that could allow him to improve his strength to the highest. And now, although he had not reached the perfect balance between the two, it was already acceptable. Most importantly, various opportunities had pushed him to this step and guided him to participate in the third round of the test at this time. In this way, he would naturally take advantage of the situation and participate in the third round of the test. As he expressed his will, there was also a force that shrouded him, and he gradually disappeared from the platform. Soon, only the shadow of the Buddha was left on the platform. Only the rich Buddha light that flowed like water and the level 9 pseudo-saint treasure were left. They're still rational. I wonder if anyone among them can pass the third round of the test. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded on the platform. This voice was the voice of the level 9 pseudo-saint treasure. And in this sentence, there seemed to be anticipation, boredom, and despair that seemed to have seen through everything. It was as if he was looking forward to someone passing the third round of the test, but he knew that it was just an extravagant hope. Even if the test was repeated hundreds of millions of times, it was impossible for anyone to pass the third round of the test. He didn't care about the situation on the platform. At this moment, Luo Fan was in a world that he was very familiar with. This world was boundless, vast to an unimaginable extent. Even he could not find the end of this world, nor could he discover where the limits of this world were. In such a world, the stability of space and time had reached an unimaginable height. It had far surpassed the vast thousand worlds and was even comparable to a perfect world. It was not much different. Apart from that, the concentration of the world's essence was also extremely rich, and the law layer of this world had even fused with the great Tao, forming a 1 and 2, a strange existence that was 2 in 1. And the entire world was immersed in a kind of neutral and peaceful aura that was mixed with a kind of destructive aura. This world was impressively the demon realm that Luo Fan had stayed in before participating in this test. How is this possible? Luo Fan frowned as such a thought flashed through his mind. The demon realm was a powerful world with 54 sages. It was not much weaker than the Earth's universe. Even a sage would not be able to easily create such a world. He did not believe that a level 9 fake sage like the Buddha could create such a terrifying world as a test ground. With a thought, the 4 halos around him that had turned into spheres and wrapped around him shook slightly. Then, they condensed behind his head and turned into 4 halos. As the 4 halos swayed slightly, time and space changed, and his figure instantly disappeared from where he was. When he reappeared, he was already in the demon realm, above an island in the war-torn sea. This was the island that he had stayed in after entering the demon realm. It was also the location of the 3 sects, the Azure Temple, the Yin God Society, and the Wu Yin Temple. Obviously, he wanted to see the place he was familiar with to see what was going on here, and whether it was the real demon realm. When he arrived here, Luo Fan frowned, and a hint of understanding flashed through his eyes. He did not need to observe carefully to know that this was definitely not the demon realm. At least, it was not the demon realm that he had arrived at. It was not because of anything else, but because this island was still a desolate place. There was not even a single person here, and there were only all sorts of exotic beasts. Furthermore, apart from that, the perilous land created by the battle between the true Venerate and others in the war-torn misty ocean did not exist at all. The entire war-torn sea seemed so peaceful. There was no chaos at all. This is the demon realm from a long time ago. Luo Fan guessed. He thought about it carefully and realized that ever since he entered this world, he did not sense any traces of humans at all. He did not even sense the existence of cultivators. The powerful auras that he sensed were only the auras of exotic beasts without intelligence. In this situation, it was highly possible that this entire world had just been created and humans had not yet been born in this world. In other words, cultivation had not appeared in this world, and the born Taoist aptitude had not been born yet. This should not be the real world that I understand. I just don't know if it's an illusion or one of the special worlds created by the level 7 fake sage. Various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became calm. This world was too vast, too advanced. He did not believe that the Buddha Supreme could create such a world. If he could, he would have become a sage long ago and become immortal. Why would he need to leave behind this inheritance? Chapter 1304. Why isn't there even a hint this time? Luo Fan looked at this world and could not help but feel puzzled. What was the 3rd round of the test about? How could he pass the test in such a strange world that he could not figure out? It couldn't be that he had to destroy this world in a special way like the 1st round of the test, right? Just when Luo Fan had this thought, another strange voice suddenly echoed in his ears. Expand this world by 10 times, and you will pass this test and obtain the inheritance left by Master. This voice was the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. For some reason, the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure did not come when he entered this world, but only came at this moment when he had the idea of needing to pass the test. Expand this world by 10 times. Luo Fan could not help but be stunned. Compared to destroying a part of the world, expanding the world was more than 100 times more difficult. If Luo Fan wanted to destroy this world, he could find a way to do it, even if he had to use an extremely special method. Although he might have to pay a huge price in the end, he still had an idea. However, to expand this world by 10 times, Luo Fan could not find any idea at all. I'm not the creator of this world. Expand this world? How can I do that? Luo Fan could not help but cry out. For the creator of this world, expanding this world was not that difficult. At most, he only needed to repeat the process of creating this world to expand it. However, if he was not the creator of this world, expanding this world would be as difficult as an ordinary person trying to make an egg that had already been formed suddenly grow by 10 times. Of course, his dissatisfaction would not be answered. After the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure sent him into this world, it was as if it had never appeared. It completely ignored his existence and only sent him a single mission hint, but that was all. In such a situation, Luo Fan had expected this. Letting out such a dissatisfied yell was just to vent his frustration, and he didn't expect to get an answer from her. After a while, he calmed down. He began to think hard about how to expand this world. He thought about it for a while. He could only think of one way. That was to use a powerful force to shatter the entire world, and then reshape the world the moment it shattered, making the reshaped world 10 times larger than before. However, there were two difficulties with this method. Firstly, with his current strength, he was unable to shatter this entire world. Even if he used a special method to amplify his own strength, he would not be able to completely rebuild this world the instant it shattered. Second, and also the most important one, the world that had been reconstructed was no longer the original world. Instead, it had become a whole new world. In the end, it would become 10 times bigger, and on the surface, it might not look much different from the current world soldier, but in essence, it would no longer be the current world. That was clearly not in line with the test requirement of expanding this world by 10 times. These two difficulties made Luo Fan quickly toss aside this method. After thinking about it, his heart stirred. He lifted his feet and took a light step towards the center of this world, towards the 4 continents. Luo Fan had long known the names of the 4 continents. They were the Dongsheng Divine Continent, the Nanjian Continent, the Aparagadania Continent, and the North Continent. They were exactly the same as the Earth universe before the world shattered. Clearly, they were influenced by the Earth universe. His speed was unparalleled. In just a few hours, he had already traversed a distance of billions of light years and was directly above the Dongsheng Divine Continent. The name of the Dongsheng Divine Continent was said to be the place where the ancestors of Huaxia lived. Therefore, although Luo Fan clearly knew that the Dongsheng Divine Continent here was just a name similar to the Dongsheng Divine Continent, and that it was not really the Dongsheng Divine Continent, he still felt different about this continent. Among the 4 continents, he instinctively chose the Dongsheng Divine Continent as his first stop. It was the same feeling he had before. Throughout the entire process of traversing billions of light years from the war-torn sea to the Dongsheng Divine Continent, he did not see a single creature with a connate Dao aptitude, let alone a human. Moreover, on the 4 continents in the center of this world, there were no humans. There were not even any cultivators. Even though there were many living beings here, all of them were strange beasts of all shapes and sizes, as well as all sorts of unimaginable exotic flowers and plants, and eerie ancient trees. The entire world looked as though it had just been created, and humans had not even been born yet. Of course, the number of powerful creatures in this world was also quite large. Among them, Luo Fan even found many creatures that were not weaker than him. Some of them even faintly exuded a terrifying aura that was enough to shock him. From afar, he felt an inexplicable sense of wariness and even fear. Among them, there were more beasts of this level that appeared in this boundless Dongsheng Divine Continent. In the short period of time that Luo Fan had arrived, many of those beasts had discovered Luo Fan and were roaring at him continuously. Some of them even blasted him with violent power, as though Luo Fan's arrival had already violated their territory and challenged their dignity. Facing such malicious attacks, Luo Fan did not resist them head-on. Instead, he kept dodging and retreating. Finally, he retreated to a place where there were no such powerful beasts. He landed on a tall mountain. However, those exotic beasts did not chase after Luo Fan to kill him. It was as if they were already satisfied with expelling Luo Fan from this place. This was also very obvious. To those beasts, Luo Fan was also an unimaginably powerful existence. If there was no deep hatred, why would they purposely fight to the death with such an existence? Since Luo Fan was willing to retreat, leaving their territory, then they would naturally be satisfied and would not go overboard. Expanding in such a world is easier said than done. After Luo Fan landed, he recalled his previous experiences and could not help but laugh bitterly. In this world, it was as though he was in the demon realm. All his previous analysis of the rules and laws of the demon realm could be directly used in this world without any modifications. Therefore, when he came to this world, his mystiques were very powerful. In fact, they were much stronger than when he was on the platform. But even so, compared to this vast and powerful world, his strength was nothing at all. Facing such a world, he had a feeling that he was facing the demon realm. It was even a strange connection that he naturally established with the vast thousand worlds because of his unhindered state. Just like in the demon realm, there were no signs of it being built. What is the key? Luo Fan pondered this question carefully and began to walk around the Dong Sheng divine continent. He observed the many characteristics of the Dong Sheng divine continent. He was observing the Dong Sheng divine continent, but it was not to deduce what the Dong Sheng divine continent in the demon realm was like. He was very clear that this was impossible. Right now, the demon realm looked like it had when the world was first created. This form of existence was the most primitive and barbaric form of existence. But it was different in the demon realm. At this moment, there were 54 sages in the demon realm. There were many pseudo-sage cultivators who had reached a terrifying level, and there were countless other cultivators of different levels. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how deep their remodeling of the demon realm would be. After such a deep transformation, even if this world was like when the demon realm was first born, there would definitely be a huge difference from the current demon realm. If one wanted to deduce the appearance of the demon realm through observation of this world, it would only mislead one. There would be no real gains at all. The reason why Luo Fan observed the Dong Sheng divine continent was to see if he could find a way to complete this task through his understanding of the many special places. This was actually the last resort he could think of in a situation where he really couldn't think of any other way. This walk lasted for 100 years. Luo Fan was a second-level pseudo-sage, and his strength was many times stronger than ordinary second-level pseudo-sages. He was confident that he could even fight against a level 5 or 6 pseudo-sage. Such strength was extremely strong even in the Dong Sheng divine continent. On the entire land, except for a few strange beasts, there were no strange beasts that could compare to him. Under such circumstances, as long as Luo Fan was careful and avoided the exotic beasts that he couldn't resist, he would be able to walk freely on this continent. After walking for 100 years, Luo Fan had almost visited every place in the Dong Sheng divine continent that he felt was special. He had seen countless strange terrains and seen all kinds of uncanny workmanship of nature. He vaguely felt that his horizons had been slightly broadened. However, what he was looking for, the places and things that might be related to the expansion of this world, was to no avail. On this day, Luo Fan stood on a cliff at the edge of the Dong Sheng divine continent. He looked up at the boundless ocean and sighed in his heart. It's really impossible to find anything by searching blindly like this. It was not surprising to him that he had not found anything in 100 years. He also did not feel discouraged because he had not found that special thing or place in 100 years. This was what he had expected. On the contrary, if he had found that place or thing in 100 years, he would have suspected that someone had set up a conspiracy to deal with him because it had been too smooth. It seems like I have to use another method. As he thought this, the 4 colorless and transparent halos behind his head spun slightly and arrived in front of him. They slowly expanded and contracted, just like 4 circles of air. These 4 halos were the only things he had obtained in the first and second round of the test. Moreover, before the third round of the test, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure had given him a chance to enhance the nature and power of these 4 halos to the limit on the platform. It was obvious that these 4 halos were related to the third round of the test. In fact, it was very likely that they were the key to passing the third round of the test. He did not believe that the Buddhist venerable and the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure would be useless. Therefore, the previous method of searching around in this world could not succeed in finding a way to pass the test. In that case, it was very likely that he would need the help of these 4 halos. Placing these 4 halos in front of him, Luo Fan carefully observed these 4 halos. After entering this world, these 4 halos did not change at all. let alone resonate with something in this world. There were slight changes in the way they operated. None of them appeared. It was as if the changes in time and space had no effect on them at all. In the four worlds inside the four halos, countless cultivators and creatures were cultivating and living in them. Because the four worlds themselves were constructed by four basic existences, the relationship between the four worlds was extremely mysterious. There were all kinds of communication between them. All kinds of mysterious and strange existences were constantly entering and exiting between any two worlds. The four worlds were strung together into an incomparably perfect whole, and there was a faint feeling of improvement at all times. How should I use these four worlds to expand this world? Luo Fan observed. Although he could feel the mysteriousness of these four halos more and more clearly, he still had no clue how to use them to complete the third round of the test. He sat cross-legged on this cliff, facing the sea. He raised his hand and grabbed, and the four halos slowly shrank. In the blink of an eye, they shrank to the size of a fist and came directly to his hand. He reached out and grasped them completely. After grasping the four halos, he immersed his mind in them. He slowly closed his eyes and restrained his perception of the outside world. He used all his ability to sense the four halos, and everything in the outside world gradually disappeared from his perception. This change caused his body to unknowingly lose all aura. In a trance, he seemed to have become a stone statue that had existed on the edge of this cliff since ancient times. Time slowly passed. 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years. In the blink of an eye, 100,000 years had passed. During these 100,000 years, Luo Fan did not move at all. Even the physiological vibrations that should have appeared in his body did not appear. He was truly like a stone statue, because he had concealed himself and allowed the outside world to be battered by the wind and rain. After 100,000 years, his body had long been covered in dust. A thick layer of soil had condensed on the surface of his body, making him look no different from a stone statue. On this day, the stone suddenly shook, and the soil on its surface instantly turned into nothingness. It was completely bombarded by a powerful force until it completely disappeared, revealing the young body wrapped in the soil. At this moment, the young body seemed to have transformed from a dead object into a living creature. A life force was produced from its body, and a faint aura began to spread from its body. This life force and aura were not very powerful. Compared to the life force and aura that Luo Fan possessed, it was so insignificant that it was almost negligible. However, this aura was enough to expel everything. It was enough to let him return to his pure and clean state, no longer being battered by the wind and rain, and no longer being contaminated by any dust. Perhaps I should use this method to expand this world. An inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. After 10 years of comprehension, not only had his understanding of the four halos reached a realm that was thousands of times deeper than before, but he had also vaguely found a way to use the four halos to expand this vast world. There were 4 worlds in the 4 halos, and these 4 worlds corresponded to one of the 4 basic existences: time, space, matter, and energy. Even this vast and boundless world that seemed to be a newly established demon realm was also made up of these 4 basic existences. Under such circumstances, it was very obvious that the 4 halos corresponded to the 4 basic existences in this world. In this way, as long as the right method was found, the 4 basic existences in this world would naturally resonate with the 4 halos. With the help of this resonance, perhaps he could use the method to change the 4 halos to cause the same change in this world. When that time came, he would only need to change the existences of the 4 halos correspondingly in order to shrink this world. In order to expand this world, he would also need to make the 4 halos undergo similar changes. When he understood this, Luo Fan suddenly felt that everything had become clear. Countless inspirations emerged in his heart, and various methods to expand this world emerged one after another. Most of these methods were definitely not feasible, and all of them had great hidden dangers. Some of them were even things that he did not have the ability to do. However, compared to being at a loss and not knowing what to do before, the current situation was countless times better. Naturally, it was enough to make Luo Fan inexplicably happy. Chapter 1305. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, and countless methods emerged in his mind, but they were instantly rejected by him. This process kept repeating. This went on for several days. Luo Fan finally chose a more feasible method. However, there was a prerequisite for any method. That was, he had to make the 4 halos that had completely integrated with him resonate with the 4 basic existences of this world: time, space, matter, and energy. He had to make these 4 basic existences connect with his halos to a certain extent. This was an extremely troublesome process, and the time it would take was very likely to be unimaginable. How many years left? Luo Fan thought to himself. In the end, he realized that he could no longer predict how much time was left in this test. This was because after he entered this world, his time dimension had already been assimilated by this world. In his senses, the time dimension of this world was so compatible with him that there was nothing abrupt at all. Under such circumstances, although he knew that the flow of time in this world was definitely many times faster than on that platform. However, he had no idea what the specific multiplier was at all. Since he didn't know what the specific multiplier was, the 10 years he had spent in this world might correspond to any period of time on that platform. It might be a few years, or it might just be a few moments. It might even be that the time that the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure could support had been completely exhausted, and there was only a little bit left. In this way, Luo Fan could no longer predict how long the 3rd round of the test would last. How many days? A few months, a few years, or hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years? He let out a sigh. Luo Fan could only put this question to the back of his mind. Since he could no longer control how long he could exist in this world, the only thing he could do was to do his best to fulfill the requirements of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. This world was vast and boundless. Compared to this vast and boundless world, the 4 equally vast continents in the center of this world were like small dots. Therefore, no matter where Luo Fan was on the Dong Shang Divine Continent, he could be considered the center of this world, because compared to this entire world, any place on this continent was the same. With this understanding, Luo Fan did not choose any other place. He immediately activated the 4 halos behind his head on the cliff overlooking the sea, causing them to slowly enlarge. 3 feet, 10 feet, 100 feet, 10,000 feet, 10,000 feet. The 4 halos continued to expand until they reached a terrifying height of 1,000,000 zhong before stopping. At this moment, the 4 halos naturally couldn't hang behind his head anymore. Instead, they hovered above his head, lying flat in an indescribable position, slowly extending and contracting above his head. It continued to operate in a continuous cycle. Such a scene was so gorgeous at this moment. Under the illumination of this gorgeous scene, Luo Fan's figure actually showed a bit of sacred majesty. The location Luo Fan chose naturally didn't have any powerful exotic beasts around. Although this light circle with a diameter of 1,000,000 zhong looked very huge, it was actually very powerful. But compared to the entire Dong Shang Divine Continent, it was nothing. Compared to the entire world, it was insignificant. Therefore, such a huge change did not cause too many changes. There weren't any powerful exotic beasts showing any special reactions due to the changes here. Only some of the weaker exotic beasts in the vicinity that were indispensable to Luo Fan couldn't help but be awed by the greatness of this ring of light, prostrating themselves in worship towards Luo Fan from all directions with an inexplicable sense of piety. It gradually enveloped the entire area. After the 4 halos expanded to this extent, an indescribable undulation began to slowly spread in all directions from the 4 halos. This fluctuation was so obscure and mysterious that it even penetrated deep into the layer of laws, instantly establishing a connection with the 4 types of laws within the layer of laws. These four types of laws were obviously the four types of laws: time, space, matter, and energy. These four types of laws had an extremely close and mysterious connection with the four fundamental existences of this world: time, space, matter, and energy. Under such circumstances, these four types of laws would naturally be able to establish a connection with the four halos above Luo Fan's head that represented the four fundamental existences. The instant this connection was established, the space-time within a million zhang radius started to produce an indescribable undulation. This indescribable undulation was almost completely synchronized with the undulation produced by the four halos. Even the slightest change produced by the halos could be displayed in this area. It looked as though the four halos were the range of breathing, and this area was the activity of the lungs. The undulation emitted by the four halos continued to spread in all directions. The area of influence became wider and wider, and the effects of the influence became more and more obvious. However, such an influence was completely linked to the four fundamental existences. It went deep into the essence of all living beings and things. Therefore, even though the changes were becoming more and more obvious, no living being other than Luo Fan noticed them. To them, the entire world didn't change in the slightest. It was exactly the same as the years they had known. As the four halos connected with more and more of the four types of laws, Luo Fan gradually sensed the breathing of the world becoming wider and wider. He even vaguely sensed that the world seemed to be constantly whispering in his ears. The sounds seemed to be the sound of the great Tao, but they also seemed like meaningless noises that kept pouring into his ears. Deep in his heart, this process made Luo Fan gradually fall into a strange state. The world in his eyes started to gradually disappear, and what replaced it was an extremely empty void. It was extremely desolate, and there was even a faint sense of loneliness in it. As time passed, this strange existence continued to grow and expand. And as it grew, as it expanded, that emptiness, loneliness became more and more obvious and powerful. It was so much so that he was gradually being affected. He felt as if his mind was being influenced by it. He also became a little empty, desolate, and lonely. This feeling was so strange and shocking. However, it didn't interfere with Luo Fan's will, nor did it affect his sense of self. Under this, he could still think clearly, and he could still feel the slightest changes that were happening to him. This is the feeling of the world's will. In a trance, Luo Fan understood this point. The world's will was a kind of will. Although it wasn't the same as the will of mortals, it was still a kind of will. Naturally, it also had a special existence that was similar to the emotions of living beings. Although this special existence wasn't something that ordinary living beings could understand or imagine, that didn't mean that it didn't exist. At this moment, Luo Fan already knew that this indescribable emptiness, desolation, and loneliness were transmitted by the world's will. It was a special existence that corresponded to the emotions of living beings. It was precisely because this special existence that was similar to emotions came from the world's will. Therefore, its vastness couldn't be compared to living beings at all. Even though Luo Fan's Taoist heart was firm and almost unshakable, he couldn't help but be affected by this special existence. Of course, there was also this kind of contamination, but there were no disadvantages. It was just a simple feeling, and it wouldn't truly change his will. If this change was disadvantageous to Luo Fan and would contaminate his Taoist heart, Luo Fan would naturally feel that something was wrong immediately. He would immediately cut off this connection and eliminate the contamination from this special existence. The worlds within the four halos were extremely complete worlds. All the systems within them were extremely complete. It was naturally possible for them to generate energy and vitality on their own. Since these four worlds could generate energy on their own, the result was obvious. The fluctuations emitted by the four worlds would naturally be able to spread out endlessly in all directions. They wouldn't be unable to expand further because they had spread out to a large area and then run out of strength. As long as there was enough time, they could expand all the way to the ends of the world and envelop the entire world within these vibrations. And as these vibrations continued to expand, the four halos came into contact with more and more of the world. The area where Luo fans will came into contact with the worlds will also become larger and larger. And the emptiness, desolation, and loneliness that came from the worlds will naturally become more and more obvious. The impact on Luo fan grew stronger and stronger. 10 years later, the area where the vibrations had spread had already affected 1/10 of the Dongshang divine continent. And at this moment, Luo fan's figure, which was standing on the cliff overlooking the sea, was already exuding an extremely intense aura of emptiness, desolation, and loneliness. It felt as though he had become a synonym for these emotions, or perhaps an abstract definition of these emotions. Of course, even at this moment, Luo fan's consciousness wasn't affected. He was still clear-headed and aware of everything. He knew where these emotions were coming from. He didn't let these emotions affect his judgment or his cognition. 100 years later, the area where the vibrations had spread had already reached the entire Dongshang divine continent. At this moment, Luo fan had already been completely shrouded by the aura of emptiness, desolation, and loneliness. Even everything else in the world was affected by this aura and began to gradually gather around him. Gradually, this cliff was pushed higher and higher, and a large number of strange objects formed around him. They were trying to neutralize the strange emptiness that emanated from his body. However, this kind of effort clearly wouldn't succeed. These three emotions came from the will of heaven and earth. As Luo fan's contact with the will of heaven and earth increased, these three emotions would only become more and more intense. No matter how many objects condensed around him, in the end, as long as the entire world couldn't be condensed here, he couldn't perfectly neutralize such emotions. Just like this, after 1,000 years, the vibrations transcended the layers of oceans and enveloped the other three continents within. And at this moment, because of the aura of emptiness, desolation, and loneliness that emanated from Luo fan's body, the appearance of the cliff where he was originally staying had already changed. A strange, towering mountain had replaced the original cliff. This mountain was extremely strange. It was covered with almost every type of object that could be found in this world, and the density of the energy was so thick that it was almost solid. Moreover, the types of yuan qi contained almost all of the yuan qi that could be found in this world. It could be said that this had become the holy mountain for all cultivators. It was enough for any cultivator to cultivate in this place, and it was enough for them to find anything they wanted. Any cultivator with treasures could find everything they wanted in this place. But even so, within this mountain, there was still a sense of emptiness, desolation, and loneliness that constantly emanated from it. Even though it was blocked by the mountain, it was still strong beyond imagination. If there were humans in this world, anyone who came into contact with such emotions would instantly lose all their defenses. They would become empty, desolated, and lonely. And these three emotions would be absolute, and there would be no way to reverse them. Next 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1 million years, 10 million years, 100 million years. As the light from the four halos continued to expand, time passed slowly. Unknowingly, billions of years had passed. In 10 years, the ripples of the light would be 1/10 the size of the Dongshang divine continent. In 100 years, it would envelop the four continents. But after billions of years, the ripples from the four halos still had not reached the ends of this world. They still had not completely enveloped this world. The vastness of this world was unimaginable. It had to be known. The Dongshang divine continent, the Nanjian continent, the Aparagadania continent, and the North continent were all unimaginably huge. Each continent had to be measured in hundreds of millions of light years to be able to clearly calculate how vast it was. And after so many years, at this moment, The four continents had already been enveloped by the three emotions that were emanating from Luo Fan. The mountain that had been 100,000 zhang tall in the past had now become hundreds of millions of zhang tall. Moreover, its vastness had expanded by tens of thousands of times compared to before. Now, billions of years later, even if one looked at the scale of the four continents, that mountain was still very eye-catching. Compared to before, the scene at the top of the mountain had become even more mysterious, complicated, and unbelievable. In fact, because there were too many things piled up, this mountain had even evolved into many strange little worlds. There were even countless strange creatures born on this mountain. At this moment, Luo Fan was completely in the center of this mountain. He was at the bottom of this mountain. However, the will of heaven and earth emanated from his body. The emptiness, desolation, and loneliness had already enveloped all the living creatures on these four continents. No matter how strong these living creatures were, no matter how terrifying their own abilities were, in the face of these three emotions, they did not have the slightest ability to resist. They were completely controlled by these three emotions. All the strange beasts seemed to be on a pilgrimage. They rushed to this huge mountain from all directions and surrounded this mountain. They worshipped the mountain. More specifically, they were worshipping Luo Fan, who was emanating the three emotions at the bottom of this mountain. At a certain moment, Luo Fan's body suddenly shook. An extremely strange feeling passed through the four halos into his heart. Have we arrived? Luo Fan instantly understood what was going on, and an inexplicable confusion flashed across his face. After a while, he finally came back to his senses. With a slight calculation, he knew how long he had been here. He could not help but smile bitterly. It's actually been more than 8 billion years. It took more than 8 billion years for the waves emitted by the four halos to finally envelop the entire world. Only then did he finally establish a tight connection with all the laws of time, space, matter, and energy in this world. Such a change took many times longer than Luo Fan had imagined. Over the years, as he came into contact with the will of heaven and earth more and more, he sensed more and more special existences that were similar to emotions from the will of heaven and earth. This was also the fundamental reason why the three emotions he emanated became more and more obvious and intense. Although these three emotions did not have any intrinsic influence on him and were not enough to change his consciousness, they made him unknowingly ignore all the changes in the outside world. This included the changes in space and the changes in time. With a slight move in his heart, Luo Fan took a step forward, and his figure directly appeared on the peak of this mountain. Chapter 1306. After Luo Fan had completely returned to his normal state, the emptiness, desolation, and loneliness emanating from the will of the universe did not disappear, but it no longer emanated from his body. There was no other reason for this. At this moment, his will had completely gathered into a ball, and it had become a bright and round entity that isolated all other external emotions. This was the case even if these emotions were emanated from the will of the universe. And obviously, for these emotions to emanate from his body, it had to go through his consciousness, and he had to feel those emotions himself. Only then could he emanate those emotions. Since his consciousness had already become a ball and was completely isolated from the contamination of external emotions, no matter how powerful these external emotions were, they naturally could not emanate from his body. At this moment, the fluctuations of the four halos had already enveloped the entire world. And the connection between the fluctuations and the four laws of time, space, matter, and energy in the depths of the four worlds had also expanded to the entire world. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan had actually completely controlled the entire world on the surface. At least on the surface, the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy in this entire world were completely under his control. If he wanted to cause a certain location to collapse, reverse time, annihilate matter, and turn energy into nothingness, it was all a matter of a single thought. He did not need to expend any energy at all, and he did not even need to use any means. and anything that happened in any location in this entire world. He only needed to think about it, and he would know it clearly, as if he was seeing it with his own eyes. However, although this was already the case, it was clearly far from enough for the four halos to resonate with the four basic existences of this entire world, so that the changes of the four halos could directly reflect the entire world. Luo Fan carefully sensed the entire world, comprehending the pattern of changes between the four basic existences of the laws of this world, and sensing the strange connection between the four types of laws and the other endless laws. As his understanding of the laws of this world deepened, he had already discovered that these four basic existences, in fact, they could be considered as the core of the entire laws of this world. Or rather, foundation. The relationship between these four types of laws and the law layer was similar to the relationship between time, space, matter, and energy, the four fundamental existences, and the entire world. The whole world, in fact, everything, every phenomenon, even every abstract concept, they could all be subdivided into four basic existences and could be seen as the result of the interaction between these four basic existences. Similarly, there were four types of laws: the laws of time, the laws of space, the laws of matter, and the laws of energy. It could also go through countless transformations, countless combinations, and countless changes to form the entire layer of laws and laws. In other words, the endless and unimaginably complex laws and laws in the entire law layer could be transformed into these four types of laws through various special, simple, complex, or bizarre transformations. In other words, these four types of laws could actually be considered as the four basic laws of the law level. It was as if those four existences were the basic existences of the world. Currently, what Luo Fan could connect to were only these four basic laws. Even if he could change these four basic laws with the help of the halo, it would only be equivalent to changing the foundation of this world. For a complete world, such a change would only result in one outcome, and that was the entire world would instantly collapse due to the change in its foundation. This was similar to a completely built building. If one wanted to make this building that had already reached its limit become bigger and taller, the only way was to demolish the building and build a deeper and more stable foundation. Only then could one build a bigger and taller building on this foundation. If one did not demolish the building, but directly increased and deepened the foundation of the building while it was still in good condition, there could only be one outcome, and that was that the building would directly collapse due to the lack of connection between the top and bottom. There was no other possibility. Therefore, if Luo Fan wanted to expand this world by 10 times, he naturally could not directly change these four basic laws. Instead, he needed to expand out from these four fundamental laws. He needed to completely grasp the boundless laws of nature constructed by these four fundamental laws. He needed to completely grasp the entire layer of laws of nature, so that all the changes he made to the four halos could be directly reflected on all the laws of nature on the entire layer of laws of nature. Only in this way could he completely reflect the changes he made to the four halos on the entire world, and thus expand this world. For example, if you wanted to increase the height of a building, if you had superhuman means, you could simultaneously enlarge the building from top to bottom at the same time. Then, you would naturally be able to avoid the troublesome process of demolishing the building and rebuilding it from the ground up. Expanding these four basic laws and using them to control the entire law level was actually set up by Luo Fan more than 8 billion years ago. It was one of the processes that established a connection between the four halos in this world. Only by completing this step could he carry out the expansion of this world according to the method he had originally thought of. How many times has the flow of time been accelerated? It's actually been so many years, but less than 10 years have passed in the outside world. Luo Fan thought of the time he had spent in this world and could not help but sigh. He could not help but feel that the Buddha Supreme was unfathomable. With his own means, setting up a space-time formation that could speed up time by tens of billions, hundreds of billions, or even trillions of times would require layers of nesting. Moreover, It would consume an endless amount of magic power at every moment, so it would not be able to last for long. However, he did not expect that the Buddhist Supreme's magic treasure could actually speed up the flow of time in an entire world by at least tens of billions of times. Only he, who had really done it, knew how difficult it was. He could not help but sigh at the Buddhist Supreme. With a slight jolt in his heart, Luo Fan suddenly felt the change in his cultivation realm, and he could not help but smile faintly. It turned out that after more than 8 billion years, his cultivation realm had unknowingly reached the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage. Now, as long as he entered the state where he could see the 9 steps, he could see that the originally unreachable 3rd step was already in front of him. It seemed that as long as he put in a little more effort, with a slight step forward, he would naturally be able to step onto the 3rd step and become a level 3 pseudo-saint. Such a situation was very obvious. It could only happen when he had already cultivated to the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage. This was also very normal. After all, he had experienced more than 8 billion years, such a long time, even though he did not cultivate at all in the process. But he was always connected with the will of heaven and earth. He was constantly enduring the impact of the will of heaven and earth on his will, which was equivalent to the will of heaven and earth of this world tempering his will. Such a process was very beneficial to his will. If it was a short period of time, it would be hard to say. However, it had reached the terrifying number of more than 8 billion years, and it had reached such an unbelievable level. It directly improved his cultivation realm by a huge step, reaching the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage. After his cultivation realm increased to the pinnacle of level 2 pseudo-sage, Luo Fan felt that his strength was more than 10 times stronger than before. Even the range of his perception of the state of chaos had increased by a lot, and he seemed to have gone deeper. Many mysteries that he was not qualified to comprehend before seemed to be slightly comprehended at this time. Such a change made Luo Fan quite happy. Regardless of whether he could pass the 3rd round of the test this time, this harvest alone was enough to make him satisfied. It was a pity that this method could only be used when using these 4 halos, and it could only be used in the 3rd round of the test. If it was in an ordinary vast thousand world, it would naturally be extremely easy for Luo Fan to find a location of the will of heaven and earth. As long as he stayed in that world for a long time, he would naturally be able to become omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient in that world. At that time, it would only be a matter of a thought for him to go to the location of the will of heaven and earth. However, in a world of a level like the demon realm, it was simply difficult for him to obtain that kind of omniscient, omniscient, and omnipotent ability. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to find the location of the will of heaven and earth, it was simply impossible for him to have a thought like in the vast thousand world. It would be extremely difficult and arduous to find it. Obviously, for the will of heaven and earth, Luo Fan did not have any good methods to find it at all. Therefore, he could only use the halos formed by these 4 worlds to have a chance of coming into contact with the will of heaven and earth. The reason why this method could only be used in the 3rd round of the test was even simpler. This time, he had come into contact with the will of heaven and earth for more than 8 billion years to achieve such progress. If he was in the outside world, where the flow of time was normal, how could he waste more than 8 billion years? One must know that after more than 3 billion years, another great calamity would arrive. If he completely wasted more than 3 billion years on coming into contact with the will of heaven and earth and enduring the tempering of his will, it was really not something that could be described as a reckless waste of God's resources. Only in this test, where the flow of time had been accelerated by more than 10 billion times, could he waste time on this, letting out a long breath. Luo Fan revealed a faint look of regret on his face. Then he slowly closed his eyes. The halo above his head rapidly shrank, and in the blink of an eye, it shrunk from its original diameter of 1,000,000 feet to 3 feet like before, hovering behind his head. However, even though the halo had shrunk to this extent, the strange fluctuations that were emitted from the halo still existed, still enveloping the entire world within it. The special connection that the halo established with the world still existed. After completing this step, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed. The fluctuations that enveloped the entire world began to undergo a subtle change. Along with this change, the entire world also began to undergo a subtle change. At this moment, the entire world's breathing method gradually changed. It gradually moved in another direction, a breathing frequency that belonged to Luo Fan. Amidst this change, Luo Fan's body suddenly emitted an indescribable majesty, a supreme majesty that seemed to control the entire world. Amidst this majesty, the strange beasts that had begun to gradually become chaotic and began to gradually calm down. They began to involuntarily shift their gazes from each other to Luo Fan, who was standing on the peak of the highest mountain, the kind of supreme majesty. It was as if this person was the ruler of the world, the master of heaven and earth. For creatures from other worlds, even creatures that were countless times weaker than the strange beasts, such a change would still have a chance to resist. But for these strange beasts that were born and bred in this world, that was the supreme law that directly connected to the origin of their lives. They had no ability to resist at all. They could only gradually yield under the increasingly powerful majesty, kneel back to their original positions, and continue to worship Luo Fan on the peak of the mountain, compared to the emptiness, loneliness, and worship that was emitted by the will of the world. Although this kind of worship was not as deep as before, it contained more respect and appeared more domineering. Luo Fan did not care about this at this moment. At this moment, his entire mind had entered the layer of laws of this entire world through the four halos of light. Compared to using his own eyes to directly look at the layer of laws of this world, he now had a completely different feeling when using this method. He used his own eyes to look at the layer of laws of this world, but the perspective he used was a partial perspective. Not only could he see the layer of laws of certain range with his body as the center, but he could also see the layer of laws of a certain range. And now, when he used this method to observe the layer of laws of this world, he was observing it from a macroscopic perspective from above. What he saw was the entire layer of laws of this world, that incomparably huge and extremely complex layer of laws of this world. He could even see the vast and boundless appearance of the great Tao that had completely fused with this layer of laws of this world. Observing the entire layer of laws of this world from this perspective was a completely different experience for Luo Fan. An inexplicable smile naturally appeared on his face. In his eyes, among the endless laws of this world, there were four laws that were more or less related to all the other laws, appearing very different. Naturally, it made him feel an indescribable sense of familiarity. These four laws that covered the entire world were obviously the four basic laws of time, space, matter, and energy. With a slight thought, the halos of light behind his head changed slightly, and the fluctuations that covered the entire world became more intense and faster. Following this, the four basic laws that covered the entire world also underwent an inexplicable change. There seemed to be some kind of strange, indescribable existence gradually flowing out of these four basic laws, continuously infiltrating more and more of the endless laws and laws. And every law that was infiltrated by that strange existence naturally made Luo Fan feel a sense of familiarity, naturally giving Luo Fan the feeling that he could completely control this law or law. Clearly, this infiltration of this invisible existence was the spread of the influence that the halos of light behind Luo Fan's head had on the entire layer of laws of this world. Although there were many strange existences that spread out from these four basic laws of this world, the number of laws of this world was very, very fast. But the number of laws of this world and the layer of laws of this world was just too much. It was a terrifying number that practically surpassed the limits of numerical description. Even if it spread out at this speed, by the time Luo Fan completely infiltrated the entire layer of laws of this world and brought the entire layer of laws of this world under his absolute control, it would still take him hundreds of millions of years to achieve this. After slightly estimating this period of time, Luo Fan instead heaved a sigh of relief. It was only calculated in hundreds of millions of years. Fortunately, it was not calculated in billions of years, or even tens of billions of years. After all, he had already stayed in this world for more than 8 billion years. For the current him, a time calculated in hundreds of millions of years was nothing, and it was simply a matter of course for him to stay for another hundreds of millions of years, slowly gathering his emotions. He gradually sank into the feeling of the laws of this world being brought into his control more and more in the layer of laws of this world. The layer of laws of this world was completely fused with the great Tao, just like the demon realm. More and more of these laws of this world were brought into his control. Relatively speaking, naturally, more and more of the great Tao of this world were also brought into his control. Moreover, this kind of bringing was a nourishing and silent integration, and did not cause any special fluctuations in the great Tao, nor did it cause any strange phenomenon like a deluge of flowers falling from the sky. And as more and more great Tao was brought into his control, Luo Fan faintly felt that his understanding of the great Tao was starting to deepen. In a trance, he felt as if his own cultivation realm was starting to brew and break through to a higher level. Chapter 1307. There was still a problem with Luo Fan's calculation of time. This time, it did not take him hundreds of millions of years to control all the laws of the world. Instead, it only took him over 80 million years to achieve this. The reason why it was so much faster than he had estimated before was also very simple. It was because as he grasped more and more laws of laws in the law layer, the numerous laws of laws would be of greater help to him in grasping new laws of laws. Thus, the speed at which he grasped the entire law layer would constantly increase. The reason behind this was very simple. The number of nomological laws he had mastered was increasing. Hence, in order to master new nomological laws, he might have to go through 10,000 steps to deduce them using the 4 basic nomological laws. However, by using these nomological laws he had already mastered, he might only need 100 steps to deduce them. In this way, it was obviously a reduction of 9,900 steps. Of course, this greatly sped up his speed. On this day, when Luo Fan completely incorporated the last law into the control of the 4 halos, Luo Fan suddenly felt a sense of fullness out of thin air. An inexplicable tremor suddenly appeared all over his body. His eyes gradually opened. It's a pity that it's still a little lacking. Luo Fan could not help but sigh after sensing his cultivation realm. Over the past 80 million years, he had always felt that his cultivation was improving and that the bottleneck he encountered was becoming weaker. But even now, he still discovered that his cultivation was not as strong as before. He was still a level 2 pseudo-sage, although he was only a thin layer away from level 3 pseudo-sage, and it seemed that he could break through it with just a little poke. He was still a little lacking after all. There was no breakthrough at all. In such a situation, how could he not feel regretful? How could he face it indifferently? After all, such an opportunity was extremely rare. If he missed this one, he would have to find another opportunity to continuously improve and grind the bottleneck. He did not know how long he would have to wait. Of course, Luo Fan only sighed for a while. His cultivation of the Tao heart was so strong that it had practically attained an eternally unmoving state. Even though he hadn't obtained a true breakthrough, he'd improved quite a bit now. After thinking for a while, he already understood, and his mentality returned to normal. He carefully sensed the 4 halos. In an instant, he felt that the entire world was within his grasp. All the laws and laws in this world, even the great Tao, were already completely connected to the 4 halos. With a single thought, Yi Shiwen's eyes lit up. All the rules and laws of the world, and even the great Tao, would change accordingly. This situation was much better than what he had expected. However, he was quite satisfied. Now, I should be able to try and see if I can expand this world. Luo Fan took a deep breath, his heartbeat quickening. The rewards from the third test were not very important to him, and he did not have much expectations for it. However, compared to the rewards after passing the test, Luo Fan was more concerned about passing the test itself. There was no other reason than that he had worked hard for hundreds of millions of years to pass the third test. Just the third test alone. It had already been more than 8 billion years. Not to mention the second test and the first test. The combined length of time had even exceeded an era of the universe on Earth after the shattering of the world. Humans were like this. The more you put in for something, the more reluctant you would be to give it up. Although Luo Fan was already a peak level, 2 pseudo-sage existence. Even so, he could not avoid this mentality. He had put in so much effort to pass the third test. Now, he had already unknowingly become reluctant to give up on this test. Now, even if the rewards for passing the test were completely canceled, he would never give up on passing the third test. It was precisely because of this mentality that Luo Fan, who had already reached the end of the third test and was about to make his last attempt, started to get excited. He actually could not control his heartbeat. After slowly calming his emotions, Luo Fan stretched out his hands. As he moved, the halos behind his head slowly floated between his hands. In a short while, they fell between his hands like a steering wheel and were grasped by his hands out of thin air. As Luo Fan grasped them, the 4 halos that were originally rotating and circulating shook slightly and stopped the process of continuous circulation. They were directly fixed in place. Endless lights and shadows flashed in Luo Fan's eyes. These lights and shadows were filled with endless lines. These were the truth of the world. It was the scene where the phenomena on the surface of the entire world overlapped with the laws on the back. Then he exerted a little force in his hands, and the 4 halos began to rotate. The 4 worlds within the 4 halos had undergone a subtle change, and the gaps between the worlds seemed to have been blurred. The 4 worlds that were originally clearly separated actually showed signs of completely merging into one world. However, this kind of fusion was different from a normal world that had 4 basic existences. It was like a fusion of sheets of paper overlapping to form a book. In other words, the fusion of these 4 worlds was an overlapping fusion. Based on this trend, after the fusion of the worlds, they were like a book, forming a form of existence that was both one and clearly separated. The changes in the world inside the halos affected the entire world. As the changes occurred, the entire world shook violently. The shaking was so obvious that even the many exotic beasts in this world instantly discovered it. An indescribable sense of panic was instantly emitted from these exotic beasts, causing the world to suddenly become gloomy and gloomy. At the same time as the emotions of the countless living beings changed, the world that was hidden in an unknown place changed as well. As the tremors appeared, the emptiness, desolation, and loneliness emitted by the will of the world gradually disappeared, replaced by a sense of anticipation. An inexplicable sense of panic gradually replaced the 3 strange existences from before. As the changes occurred, Luo Fan felt an invisible, strange force acting on his hands. This force had no other purpose other than to hinder his movements. This caused Luo Fan to feel an inexplicable resistance towards the changes in the 4 worlds inside the halos. The source of this invisible, strange force could not be found at all. In fact, even he could not see the nature of this force. However, he immediately knew that this was the resistance of the world, or rather, the inertia of the world. This world had been like this ever since it was created. Even Luo Fan knew that it had been like this for more than 8 billion years. It had already been more than 8 billion years. The direction and method of its development had already become a kind of inertia, an inertia that would continue to develop according to the previous way of development. This kind of inertia caused any action that wanted to change the way the world developed to reverse this kind of inertia. Naturally, there would be an extremely obvious obstruction. This was the reason for the appearance of this invisible, strange force. In the face of this obstruction, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. With this obstacle in his way, he knew that his chances of success had greatly increased. Because this obstruction, compared to what he had expected, this world's obstructive power was much weaker. After all, this world was equivalent to the existence of the demon realm. Compared to this kind of existence, Luo Fan was an ant-like existence. If this world wanted to stop his actions, then the power that was obstructing him could probably completely erase him in the first place. It could even completely erase all traces of his existence in all time and space. It could be done. But now, this kind of obstruction actually only slowed down the speed at which he changed the world inside the four halos. What did this mean? This meant that although this world itself had the inertia of continuing to develop according to the original line of development, it also had the expectation of continuing to develop according to the direction of development after his distortion. In other words, the world itself felt that Luo Fan's changed way of development was better than the original way of development. Only in this way, this kind of obstruction would be much smaller than the original one produced by this world. Even the world thought that Luo Fan could succeed. So how could Luo Fan not have greater confidence in his success? The supernatural power in his body surged and erupted with a power that was enough to completely crush a vast thousand worlds into a ball. He resisted the obstruction produced by that world and continued the changes of the four worlds within the halos. After an unknown period of time, a strange, soft sound came from the four halos. This soft sound was so mysterious. Although it was a faint sound, it contained endless mysterious power. It directly broke through the barriers of time and space and spread across the entire world, covering an unknown area of billions of light years in this world. In this soft sound, the obstructive force that originally acted on Luo Fan's body suddenly disappeared into thin air. Then, the entire world seemed to have begun to melt. The four basic existences that were originally extremely stable, time, space, matter, and energy, seemed to have become plasticine, as if they could be molded by external forces at will. As such changes occurred, every breath that Luo Fan took agitated the four basic existences around him, causing the space-time around him to seem like it had turned into jelly and trembled. Whether I succeed or not depends on this step. Luo Fan let out a long breath. With a thought, his will followed the fluctuations emitted by the four halos and directly swept across the entire world, covering an unknown area of billions of light years in this world, the unknown height of the sky above, and the unknown thickness of the earth below. Then, with a thought, the entire world began to gradually expand and gradually expand. The distance between the sky and the earth, the area of the four continents, the thickness of the earth, the area of the ocean, and even the concentration of the vitality in the void, and so on and so forth. Everything continued to increase, and strengthen during this process. Such changes were so mysterious and complicated that even Luo Fan could not help but feel an indescribable sense of shock in the face of such changes. Although these changes came from his hands, the vastness and the supreme power that emanated from it contained countless mysteries of the universe and the mysteries of the great Tao. As he watched all these changes, Luo Fan was in a trance. It was as if he was watching the unfinished process of the birth of the world continue. Vaguely, he seemed to see his supreme existence standing in the center of the world, holding an axe and opening up the world. Amidst this shock, his eyes gradually became vacant. Specks of strange light flickered in his eyes. Every spot of this light seemed to contain the supreme truth that any cultivator would be willing to give up everything to comprehend. She was in a daze, in a trance, and in a daze, suddenly, a silent joy appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The originally invisible karma suddenly became tangible before his eyes. The originally shapeless and incorporeal karma suddenly became solid before his eyes. In the instant that karma suddenly became tangible, he discovered that the first level of karma, which he had needed to spend a lot of effort to use, had suddenly become instinctive. The difficulties in using the law of cause and effect had become common sense to him. Above that, he had no clue at all. He couldn't find any way to use the second level of the law of causality, but it suddenly became so clear and within reach that he felt as if he could do it with just a slight stretch of his hand. With this inexplicable feeling, Luo Fan slowly stretched out his right hand. He stretched out his hand. He grasped the originally abstract karma in his hand. In an instant, he understood that he'd grasped the second level of utilization of the law of karma. He could already rely on his own strength to directly determine the result without needing a reason. The first level of the law of karma and the second level of the law of karma appeared to be only one level apart. It was as if the only difference was between needing to determine the cause and not needing to determine the cause. But in fact, the difference between the two was like the difference between heaven and earth. In fact, Luo Fan had seen it in the past. Among all the pseudo-sage cultivators that he'd heard of, none of them had been able to advance to the second level of the law of karma. It was the same for level 8 and level 9 pseudo-sage cultivators. This alone showed how difficult it was to master the second level of the law of karma. It also showed how powerful Luo Fan was to be able to master the second level of the law of karma at this time. When Luo Fan felt that he'd completely mastered the second level of the law of karma, he suddenly discovered that the bottleneck between level 2 pseudo-sage and level 3, which had been shackling him, had suddenly disappeared. The third step of the 9 steps below the sage level. He didn't know when he'd arrived at his feet. An indescribable sense of satisfaction and comfort arose spontaneously. At this moment, he felt that everything in him was rising in an unimaginable direction. It only stopped after rising to a level that was hundreds of times his original level. An indescribably powerful aura rushed out of his body and instantly engulfed the entire expanding world. The world seemed to distort slightly at this moment, and all the living beings in it felt as if a supreme existence was suppressing them at this moment. After stepping onto the third step of the 9 steps, he was one step closer to the sage realm. The state of chaos suddenly seemed to become extremely clear and real at this moment. In a trance, he felt as if he could directly enter the state of chaos as long as he took a step forward. I've finally broken through. An extremely satisfied smile appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he instantly suppressed the urge to step into the state of chaos. He knew very well that this urge was brought about by his sudden great improvement and unprecedented clarity of the state of chaos. It could be said that it was caused by an illusion. If he really stepped into the state of chaos, what awaited him would be the same outcome as his clone back then. All traces of his existence would be completely erased. Even the traces in other people's memories would be the same. He sensed the changes in his body and knew that his improvement had already surpassed the limit of the layer of rune structure that covered his body. If the rune structure did not strengthen further, then when he returned to his flawless state, the special characteristic that would make anyone feel as if they would form a level 3 pseudo-saint soul brand in the depths of his soul would no longer be concealed. Luo Fan only frowned slightly at this point before throwing it to the back of his mind. The rune structure was integrated with the scale of the spiritual kingdom in the demon realm, and the spiritual kingdom was clearly integrating the entire island. Once the spiritual kingdom completed the integration of the entire island, the rune structure's power would obviously continue to increase by another level. At that time, perhaps he would be able to regain the effect of blocking his special characteristic. However, even if there was no way to achieve that effect, Luo Fan did not mind. That would at most bring him some trouble, and compared to the benefits he would obtain, what was it? At this moment, the entire world was still constantly expanding, and the process of the creation of the world was still continuing. Compared to the beginning, the current world was already 6 or 7 times vaster. Compared to the beginning, there was already a world of difference between the sky and the earth. Looking at the changes that were taking place in this world, Luo Fan no longer had the mood to continue comprehending it. Chapter 1308. By the time Luo Fan once again reached a flawless and unhindered state, several decades had already passed. Sure enough, as he had expected, when he reached the flawless state of the level 3 pseudo-sage, the rune structure that had concealed the unique characteristics of his flawless state lost most of its effects. Anyone could see his figure and produce a level 3 pseudo-sage brand belonging to Luo Fan in the depths of their soul. Feeling such a change, Luo Fan had a look of helplessness and joy on his face. He felt helpless because the failure of the rune structure had brought him a lot of trouble. But what made him happy was that this flawless state was still as wonderful and powerful as he had expected. After his body had completely reached a flawless state, Luo Fan slightly sensed the changes in the world and found that the world had expanded a lot again. Obviously, everything was going quite smoothly. It was only a matter of time before he reached the number of 10 times that he had expanded. In other words, Luo Fan no longer needed to do anything. As long as he waited quietly, time would naturally push him to the moment when the third round of the test was completed. At this moment, Luo Fan began to get curious. What exactly was the opportunity that could give people the possibility of becoming a sage? Why would it have such power? After getting this opportunity, what kind of sage would he have to do to become a sage? What kind of sage would he be? Would he be a sage like the 54 sages in the demon realm, or the 7 supreme sages in the earth universe? All these doubts began to emerge in his heart, and he couldn't help but look forward to it. At this moment, it was indeed time to consider this question. If he had considered this question before, he would have been biting off more than he could chew. However, if he still didn't consider it now, he would be too heartless and open-minded. Unfortunately, no matter how he thought about these questions, he couldn't find the answers to them. After all, he had only come into contact with the opportunity that could give people the possibility of becoming a sage after participating in the test. He was completely unfamiliar with this opportunity. Under such circumstances, how could he find the truth of that opportunity so quickly? Since they couldn't find the truth behind chance, how could they be sure what would happen after chance became a sage? Would he become a sage like the 54 sages, or would he become a sage like the 7 sages? Time passed slowly as he thought about it. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan's body suddenly shook. An indescribable feeling came over him. In a trance, he felt as if his entire body and mind had completely merged with a boundless world. This world was more powerful, more terrifying, and more incredible than any world he had seen since he stepped into the Earth universe. Even the demon realm, which had 54 sages, was so small in front of this world. It was so insignificant. This world was obviously the great world that he had worked hard to expand by more than 10 times over these years. As he sensed that this world had completely fused with his body and mind, Luo Fan suddenly understood that he had passed the third round of the test. He had already safely and completely expanded this world by 10 times. Then, he knew that the 4 halos he had obtained had already lost their meaning. With a slight jolt in his heart, the 4 halos shook slightly. They instantly dispersed and became 4 separate, independent halos. They broke away from his control and began to expand crazily in front of him. They crazily filled the entire world and the entire heaven and earth. When the size of the halos expanded to more than 1,000,000 feet, the 4 halos began to collapse at the same time. The 4 halos seemed to be made up of countless tiny light spots. They began to scatter in all directions and gradually spread to every inch of the void in the entire world. They gradually merged with the 4 basic existences in this world: time, space, matter, and energy. Gradually, they merged with everything in this world. Following this change, the entire world began to gradually change. He himself became more and more real, while the world became more and more illusory. At a certain moment, the entire world completely collapsed and disappeared in front of his eyes. It was as if he was the only person left in this universe. Apart from him, everything else seemed to have become an absolutely illusory existence. Everything seemed to have lost all meaning. Then, the illusory world began to gradually shrink and turn into nothingness. The speed and extent of this shrinkage had reached a level that exceeded everyone's imagination. In just a few short breaths, the entire world had directly turned into a halo in front of Luo Fan. It was a halo that was only 3 feet wide and looked like a light mirror. After this halo was formed, it directly stuck to the back of his head. Just like the halo formed by the 4 worlds before, it steadily stopped at the back of his head and slowly rotated in an incredible and mysterious way. Looking at the frequency of its rotation, it contained some kind of indescribable mystery. Under the shroud of this mystery, Luo Fan's entire person seemed to have become countless times more noble, exuding a feeling of being above everything. I didn't expect someone to actually complete the test this time. At this moment, a voice was heard in Luo Fan's ears. This voice was extremely familiar to Luo Fan. It was the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. He looked around again and found that he had already appeared in an inexplicable void. This void was boundless, but it was faintly emitting a faint golden light. This golden light wasn't made of any substance or light. Instead, it seemed to be the color of the void itself. Is this the body of the Buddha? Such a thought flashed through his mind in an instant. When he had this thought, he carefully observed and confirmed his feeling. Sure enough, this was the place he saw every time he passed the test and before the next one. It was the body of a huge Buddha that existed in the center of the platform. The boundless void around him was obviously a world in the body of the Buddha, and it was very likely that it was the scene inside the Buddha. "Senior, how long has it been?" Luo Fan asked. He believed that the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure definitely knew what he was asking. As expected, the moment he asked this question, the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was heard. 9 years. It has been 9 years since you started participating in the test. 9 years. Luo Fan sighed when he heard this. The more than 8 billion years that he had experienced were only equivalent to 9 years in the outside world. This feeling was so weird that it was indescribable. Even he suddenly felt like he did not know how to react. As Luo Fan sighed, the indescribable shape and color of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure appeared in front of him. It still looked the same as before. There were no abnormal changes. But somehow, Luo Fan could feel an inexplicable sense of loss from it, an indescribable sense of loss. After a while, Luo Fan said, "Senior, may I ask if I passed the test?" "Of course. You have expanded the safety and stability of the primordial world by 10 times. Naturally, you have passed the test," the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said. "So that world is the primordial world." Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He had obtained many things from the name, but they were all vague and difficult to describe in words. "Since I passed the test, may I know where the inheritance of Senior Buddha is?" Luo Fan asked curiously. "That inheritance, didn't you already obtain it?" The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure suddenly said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan instinctively wanted to refute, but he soon realized that the inheritance was the so-called opportunity to become a sage. In other words, the so-called opportunity to become a saint. Could it be the world that he obtained after passing the 3rd round of the test? That light circle? Could it be that Senior is referring to this thing? Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed at the back of his head. Behind his head, the light circle that was emitting gray light was rotating in an extremely mysterious way. A mysterious aura was constantly emitting from it, sweeping the surroundings, causing the extremely wide space around Luo Fan's body to be filled with such mysteriousness. Of course, do you think that the opportunity is something physical? The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan opened his mouth, but in the end he could not say anything. That was indeed what he had thought before. After all, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure had clearly said that after passing the test, he would be able to obtain the inheritance of the Buddha Supreme and obtain the opportunity to become a sage. Since that was the case, the opportunity and the test should be separated. Of course, after he passed the test, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure would give him something to obtain the opportunity. However, of course, he could not say such words now. In fact, after the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said these words, the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was the only reasonable way. After each of the 3 tests, Luo Fan would obtain something that was extremely difficult to obtain in the outside world, or rather, something that could not be obtained at all. This kind of thing could greatly increase Luo Fan's strength and make him many times more powerful than before. According to this logic, after passing the 3rd test, he would definitely be able to obtain something that would bring him great benefits. And this kind of harvest would definitely be of a higher level than what he had obtained in the 1st and 2nd tests, and would bring him greater benefits. According to the benefits obtained in the first 2 rounds, the only thing that could be obtained in the 3rd round was that opportunity and that inheritance. That was the only thing that could make sense and conform to the logic of increasing the benefits one could obtain. Is this the opportunity? Luo Fan raised his hand and summoned the halo behind his head to him. He slowly stroked the halo and murmured. After figuring out the reason why this halo was the opportunity, Luo Fan fell into a deeper doubt. Why could this world bring him the possibility of becoming a sage? After thinking for a long time, he still could not find the answer. In the end, he could only look at the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure and ask, "Senior, may I ask how I can become a sage with the help of this item?" The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure did not move, but Luo Fan seemed to feel a sense of contempt coming from it. In an instant, Luo Fan knew that he was being despised by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind. Soon, he knew what mistake he had made, and he could not help but smile bitterly. At this moment, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure also revealed the answer and said, "Do you think I know this? Even my master didn't know how to become a sage with the help of this item, let alone me." Luo Fan sighed and shook his head with a bitter smile. He knew that what the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said was right. If the Buddhist venerable knew how to become a sage with the help of this item, he would have become a sage long ago. There would be no need to leave behind such an inheritance. There would be no need to set up a test to let people obtain this so-called primordial world. For others to become a sage, even if it was someone close to them, it would obviously not be as easy as becoming a sage himself. All right, since you have completed the test, the others don't need to go through the test anymore. The others won't need to take the test anymore, the level 9 pseudo-divine treasure said. With that, countless lights and shadows appeared in front of Luo Fan. There were trillions of worlds shown in these lights and shadows. And among those worlds, there were more than 1,000 worlds that were slightly lit up. Luo Fan glanced over. He discovered that there was a tester in each of the 1,000+ worlds. Most of these testers were living beings that he had created with the help of the first level of the law of causality. Only a few of them were the dozens of pseudo-sages who had participated in this test with him back then. At this moment, Luo Fan had already passed 3 rounds of tests and became the true successor of the Buddhist venerable, obtaining the inheritance of the Buddhist venerable. His identity was completely different. With a single glance, he could clearly see the test that the more than 1,000 people were undergoing, as well as the progress of the test. The more than 1,000 testers were still in the first round of tests. Those living beings that were created by Luo Fan could not resist the test's shielding of memories. Each of them could only muddle-headedly survive in one world after another, just like the living beings that were born and raised in those worlds. On the other hand, the pseudo-sage existences of different levels were different from them. Even though they could not completely retain all of their memories like Luo Fan and the others, they could more or less retain some of them. However, it was also these preserved memories that made them want to find a way to pass the test in each world. This made them want to find a way to pass the test in each world, thus becoming chaotic. In the end, every world that they had experienced became a cage. It brought them pain. They would only suffer again and again, and they would not be able to obtain the alternative fun that the other 1,000 living beings had. The flow of time throughout the test was the same. In other words, in the past 9 years, Luo Fan had experienced hundreds of millions of years, and they had obviously experienced hundreds of millions of years too. In such a long period of time, they had to change worlds almost every 100 years. Every 100 years, they had to find a way to pass the test in a brand new world. The total number of worlds that they had experienced was calculated in units of millions. If these pseudo-sage existences who participated in the test had their memories intact and their minds intact, they would naturally be able to withstand such a terrifying number easily. In fact, even if all of their memories were sealed, it would not have much impact on them. At most, they would only be reincarnated millions of times. When the final test ended, they would naturally return to normal the moment their memories were completely recovered. However, the worst thing was that they were in neither of these two situations. They had recovered part of their memories, but they could not recover all of them at all. In this way, the memories that they had experienced in each world would unknowingly mix with their own memories. Each time, a small part of their original memories could not be recovered, and a small part of their memories in the previous world would replace that part of their memories, and they would treat it as their own memories. After repeating this for so many times, these pseudo-sage existences had almost forgotten their own selves. In each world, they were just instinctively looking for and testing that world, but they had actually forgotten their purpose of doing so. When Luo Fan saw the changes that occurred to these pseudo-sage existences, he could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. An inexplicable sense of pity welled up in his heart. If a cultivator wanted to cultivate from zero to the pseudo-sage realm, the amount of experience and time it would take would be too much for an ordinary person to bear and cause their mind to collapse. However, such existences had become like this in just a short period of 10 years because of a test. They did not even know if they could recover their own selves after the test ended. How sad was that the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure had presided over countless tests, so it was used to such situations. However, they didn't do anything. No one knew what they did, but in an instant, billions of worlds collapsed. The more than 1,000 living beings disappeared from those worlds one by one and reappeared in the world where they first saw the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. Chapter 1309. After these creatures appeared, they didn't even have time to figure out what was going on around them before they disappeared into thin air. Whether it was the pseudo-sage cultivators or the creatures created by Luo Fan using the law of karma, they all disappeared. As they disappeared, the world instantly returned to its original appearance. It was impossible to tell that so many powerful cultivators had appeared in this world in the past 10 years, and it was impossible to tell that there had been such a mysterious test there in the past. Luo Fan naturally did not care about the other cultivators, nor did he try to sense where they had gone. However, he was able to sense the living beings that he had created with the help of the law of karma. The moment they disappeared, he knew that the ship had returned to the demon realm with those creatures and reappeared on the vast lake at the center of the island. To other cultivators, this test was just a simple test, but to these creatures, it was equivalent to giving them millions of completely different lives. After experiencing millions of lives, all of the creatures were different from when Luo Fan first created them. All of the 1,000 or so living beings were no longer as muddle-headed and confused as they had been in the past. Every living being had already formed their own worldview and had their own goals to strive for. These creatures returned to a familiar place and found that they were surrounded by familiar figures. At first, they were very confused and did not know what had happened. But soon, they remembered what they had experienced and what they had gained in that extremely special and incredible world. At this moment, the entire ship, as well as the ship itself, fell into silence. In the end, it was the boy who had led the group that spoke. "I want to go into closed-door cultivation. What are your plans, fellow cultivators?" His every word and action had become many times more mature than before. Although his appearance hadn't changed much, the look in his eyes was completely different from before. There was boundless wisdom contained in his eyes, and there was a faint hint of vicissitudes in his eyes. He addressed everyone else as fellow cultivators. He was no longer the same as before. It was clear that the millions of lies he had experienced had a shocking effect on him. If it was in the past, anything he said would naturally cause the beings of the same origin as him to respond in unison. However, at this moment, after he spoke, the scene was filled with indescribable silence. Everyone stood there quietly and looked at each other. The scene fell into silence. After a long while, a creature with the head of a tiger spoke. "I want to see the wonders of the world. Once I achieve the innate Tao body, I will leave this place. I will travel the world." His words seemed to have turned on a switch, and all the living beings present began to express their goals one after another. Among them, their goals were naturally very strange. Some wanted to cultivate, some wanted to travel, some wanted to live ordinary lives, and some wanted to see through everything and adapt to their circumstances. Although there were so many thoughts, everyone knew their thoughts would definitely not change. The thoughts of others could not be changed either. Therefore, after all the different opinions were expressed, the quarrel that should have occurred didn't happen at all. Therefore, after all the different opinions were expressed, the quarrels that should have happened did not happen. Some of them found a place on the lake and used their own special method to build a secluded cultivation place. Some of them left the lake and found a place to live in the mountains around the lake. Some of them even left the area and went to other places on the island. Some of them even left the island directly. Before long, the only thing left in that spot was the strange tree that looked like a big boat. It slowly sank to the bottom of the lake. It was not committing suicide, but it was planning to cultivate, refine its own body, and create a born Taoism form. Then, it would choose its own life. Luo Fan could sense the changes that were happening to these creatures through his connection with them. He could not help but smile faintly. Although he didn't have any deep feelings for these creations, he didn't care much for them. However, they were created by him after all, so he naturally felt different from other creatures. Now that he saw that they had found their own way of living, the worries in his heart were completely gone. While those creatures were telling each other about the lives they wanted, the world that they had just left was undergoing earth-shaking changes. That world began to collapse slowly and gradually turned into a golden Buddha light. It slowly shrank toward a certain place, the place where the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure originally existed. It seemed to belong to the center of this world. The speed of this shrinkage was extremely fast. Just the way it shrank was mysterious beyond imagination. It felt as if everything in this world, including time, space, matter, and energy, seemed to be transformed from the Buddha light. Now time, space, matter, and energy were all transformed into wisps of Buddha light in an indescribable way. They quickly poured into the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. Looking at this way of transformation, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Such a change was beyond his imagination. He had stayed in that world for such a long time that he had almost established an extremely close connection with that world. In that world, he had obtained the great power of omnipotence and omniscience. However, even so, he had never imagined that that world was actually the same kind of existence as the worlds of the 4 halos he had created before. They were also constructed using an extremely pure existence, using a mysterious method. They were not natural worlds. At this moment, he suddenly felt more clearly the gap between himself and the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. This was not the gap between strength, but the gap between realms and the method of using energy. It was a gap that almost made people despair. It was like if someone told you the answer to a math problem clearly and even told you every specific step of solving the problem. No matter what you did, no matter how many strands of your hair turned white. Even if you vomited blood, you still couldn't understand it. That sense of frustration was really enough to make one vomit blood. At this moment, what Luo Fan encountered was similar to this situation. One could imagine the sense of frustration. When the world completely turned into a Buddhist light and was completely absorbed by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, there was only an extremely strange void left around. It was a kind of absolute nothingness that seemed to be limited by the concept of the void. In this void, apart from the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, There was no other tangible or intangible existence. Then there was a flash of Buddhist light. The figure of a huge Buddha appeared in this void. Immediately afterward, Luo Fan felt his body distort, and his position was transferred by an indescribable existence. He directly appeared outside the body of the Buddha and arrived in this void where there was no other existence except for the Buddha and the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure. The moment he arrived here, Luo Fan had an indescribable feeling as if his entire body was going to be completely disintegrated and devoured along with this void. It was as if he had completely turned into absolute void. At the same time that this feeling was born, the halo formed by the primitive world behind his head vibrated differently than it should have. Then he realized that he seemed to have entered a normal space and time. The feeling of absolute nothingness around him was like he was in another world, another space and time. It no longer affected him in the slightest. Could this be the gap between the heavens and the earth? Luo Fan murmured as he looked at the surrounding nothingness. Of course not. When he murmured, the voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was directly transmitted into his ears. The transmission method of this voice was extremely strange, as if it had appeared out of thin air. It did not pass through any space or medium at all. It seemed to appear out of thin air. It was as if it was pouring directly into his ears, but also as if it was directly transmitted into his heart. This place is pure nothingness. It's a void created by my power. The voice of the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure continued. Simply creating a void? Then where is this void? Luo Fan asked. Since it's void, where else would it be? Of course, it's nowhere. Nowhere. So that's how it is. Luo Fan was stunned at first, but then he came to a sudden realization and understood. This void was clearly not in any one place, but it could also be said to be in any place. It could be said that it was in the demon realm, in any lesser kiliocosm, or in any greater kiliocosm. It could even be said that it was between the earth and the universe. After all, it was just a void. All right, enough with the nonsense. Let's proceed with the last inheritance procedure. The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure saw the look of realization in Luo Fan's eyes, but did not care what Luo Fan had realized. There's still one last procedure? Isn't the inheritance over? Luo Fan frowned. It's just the final icing on the cake. The real inheritance is, of course, over. The level 9 pseudo-sage treasure said. After saying that, without waiting for Luo Fan to react, the Buddha began to move. It held the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure and pressed it towards the back of Luo Fan's head in a way that seemed to be extremely slow, but Luo Fan could not resist or dodge at all. In the blink of an eye, the Buddha's hand had already come into contact with the back of Luo Fan's head. At the same time, the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure was completely pressed into the halo behind Luo Fan's head, which was the primeval world that he had obtained after passing the third test. It was 10 times the size of the demon realm that had just been established. At that moment, a thunderous sound rang out in that world. The thunderous sound was extremely loud, and it contained an indescribable power. Under this sound, Luo Fan felt that even the slightest detail in his body had received a strong shock. He felt like his entire body was about to fall apart and completely disintegrate at this moment. His mind became blank at this moment. All the changes in the outside world and all the changes in time and space, they were completely out of his perception at this moment. After an unknown period of time, when he regained his senses, he found that there was only absolute nothingness left around him. Whether it was the Buddha or the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, they had completely disappeared. It was as if they had never appeared before. What exactly happened just now? Luo Fan frowned and thought. With a thought, he felt the changes in his body. He could feel the changes in his body. The halo behind his head, which was originally emitting light, had become completely transparent at this moment. On the surface, it seemed like there was nothing behind his head, and there was no so-called halo at all. Such a change was the same as when the 4 halos he had obtained were refined to the limit by the Buddha's light. The situation was the same when they were refined to the limit. However, compared to the 4 halos back then, the halo behind Luo Fan's head at this moment was many times stronger. It also gave him a feeling that it was a lot more vast. Sensing this halo, he even had a vague feeling that he could use this halo to go anywhere. The feeling of doing whatever he wanted to do. As soon as this feeling was born, he gently raised his hand and patted forward, and the absolute nothingness completely collapsed. His figure directly appeared in a world that he was extremely familiar with, the demon realm. Moreover, the place where he appeared was the last place where he had left the demon realm. It was above the lake in the center of the island. He had actually broken the nothingness set up by the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure with a gentle pat and returned to the place he wanted to return to. After returning to the demon realm, Luo Fan carefully sensed and found that the omnipotent feeling had weakened a lot, but it still existed faintly. It felt as if the omnipotent power was restricted by some inexplicable mechanism and could not be fully exerted. With a thought, the entire demon realm seemed to have undergone billions of subtle changes. In the end, the countless subtle changes eventually turned into a result, which was a constantly changing shape. A strange object that could change color at any time appeared in front of him. As soon as this object appeared, it naturally revealed a powerful aura, which distorted the surrounding space-time, causing a strange space-time with a radius of 100 miles to appear around this object. This strange space-time had a strange shape, and it was completely empty inside. There was only an indescribable light in it. Such a strange space-time wrapped around this strange thing, causing the shadow of a huge golden pill to appear in the sky of the demon realm out of nowhere. At this moment, all the living beings on the lake felt an indescribable fear. This fear was as if something that could crush all of them at any time was suddenly hanging over their heads and could fall down at any time, completely crushing them. As expected, Luo Fan looked at this object with a satisfied smile on his face. This object was none other than a magic treasure. Moreover, it was not an ordinary magic treasure, but a magic treasure that was equivalent to a pseudo-sage treasure. Moreover, it was a half-step pseudo-holy treasure that he had seen before, the level 9 pseudo-holy treasure that was refined by the Buddhist venerable as the prototype. As long as one had the opportunity, as long as one found the method, or even refined the mysteries of the great Tao that the Buddhist Supreme had comprehended, such a magic treasure would naturally evolve and become a true pseudo-sage treasure. It could be said that it was enough to set off a bloodbath anywhere in the world, and it was enough to drive any cultivator who had yet to become a pseudo-sage crazy. However, such a pseudo-sage treasure was created by Luo Fan with just a thought. Or to be more precise, this pseudo-sage treasure was not created by Luo Fan, but by the entire demon realm. It was created by Luo Fan using the second level of the law of causality, and with the help of the powerful power of the entire demon realm itself. This method of using the law of causality to create a magic treasure was impossible when Luo Fan's application of the law of causality was still limited to the first level. This was because the first level of application of the law of causality required the definition of cause and effect at the same time. In this way, if Luo Fan wanted to create a magic treasure, he would need to first give an initial and reasonable cause that might eventually lead to the formation of the magic treasure. It was fine for ordinary magic treasures, but if it was a powerful magic treasure, it would not be easy to make the magic treasure take shape. For example, the most common method that Luo Fan used was to raise his finger as the cause to achieve a certain result, but it was difficult to use it to create a magic treasure. It was not because the reason was unreasonable, nor was it because the reason could not lead to the formation of the magic treasure. Instead, it was because the process required to achieve the result of the birth of the Dharma treasure was too long, too tortuous, and too much luck. Unless Luo Fan's cultivation realm could reach a height that he could not imagine at this moment, he would not be able to make this process appear completely, and naturally, he would not be able to completely define the cause and effect. However, Now that he had reached the second level of application of the law of causality, the situation was completely different. This was because the second level of application of the law of causality did not need to define the cause at all. It only needed to define the effect. In this case, when using the law of causality to create a magic treasure, Luo Fan only needed to define the result of the formation of this magic treasure, and the law of causality would naturally define the cause and process according to this result. Chapter 13:10. This was also the reason why this strange half-step pseudo-sage treasure could appear instantly with a thought from Luo Fan. Luo Fan stretched out his right hand, and the magic treasure fell directly into his hand. After sensing it for a while, and confirming that this magic treasure was indeed a genuine half-step pseudo-sage treasure, Luo Fan smiled slightly and threw the magic treasure into the lake below. This half-step pseudo-sage treasure was tamed in Luo Fan's hands, but the power it possessed was extremely terrifying. After falling into the lake, it naturally began to exert its power. In an instant, the appearance of the lake suddenly changed. From the original appearance of an ordinary lake, it turned into a strange time and space. This strange space-time was divided by the lake surface. Looking down from the lake surface, it was just an ordinary lake. However, after passing through the lake surface, one would find that it was not ordinary lake water at all, but an extremely strange space-time. If someone were to enter that space-time, they would discover that the characteristics of that space-time could not be described with words at all. Whether it was its size, color, or even the various strange changes that were occurring in it at every moment, they were all the same. This was the terrifying power of this half-step pseudo-sage treasure. Moreover, this was only the power of this half-step pseudo-sage treasure when it was not controlled by its master. Once a living being could master this half-step pseudo-sage treasure, or even go further, if they were not originally cultivators but comprehended the path of cultivation from this magic treasure. Once they obtained this magic treasure, they might be able to advance to the half-step pseudo-sage level. If they had the opportunity, it was not impossible for them to advance to the true pseudo-sage level with the help of this magic treasure. The changes in the lake were earth-shattering for the creatures that Luo Fan had created, who were living, cultivating in seclusion within the range of the lake. At this moment, they had all entered a place that was both familiar and strange at the same time. It was familiar because they had just escaped from a place similar to this world not long ago. It was strange because this world was fundamentally different from the world they had just escaped from. For a moment, everyone was at a loss. He was a little anxious. However, they soon felt the benefits of entering this world for their cultivation. All sorts of profound mysteries of the great Tao filled the entire world. That vast and endless energy, the indescribable throbbing that cleansed the heavens and the earth, was extremely beneficial to their cultivations. After not being able to figure out what was going on, these living beings decided to settle down in this world. Just like how they had done in the lake, they worked hard to cultivate and improve their cultivation. They wanted to improve their strength in order to achieve their goals. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about them. He casually pointed, and a boat appeared on the surface of the lake. This ship was not as huge as the previous one, nor was it as mystical. It was just an ordinary ship, as if it was a wooden ship built by an ordinary shipwright. After the ship appeared, Luo Fan's figure gently landed. He landed directly on this boat. Although the surface of the lake had changed due to the half-step pseudo-sage treasure, it had turned into a strange space-time. However, with Luo Fan's cultivation realm of the level 3 pseudo-sage treasure, how could the power of this half-step pseudo-sage treasure affect him? Under his will, the ordinary-looking wooden boat stopped on the surface of the lake, as if it was on an ordinary lake. From the looks of it, there was nothing special about it. As the breeze blew, the wooden boat began to casually float on the surface of the lake. There was an inexplicable sense of comfort and calmness. Luo Fan sat at the bow of the boat and began to close his eyes. He slowly comprehended the halo behind his head. According to the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure, this circle of light was extremely powerful. Even if it was a primitive world, it was also an opportunity to become a sage. However, ever since Luo Fan had obtained this halo, he had not had the time to properly sense its use. He did not know how this halo could give him the opportunity to become a saint. At this moment, he could clearly feel that there was still a period of time before the Ling Nation completely unified the entire island. Naturally, it was the best time to comprehend the wonders of this halo. He threw his consciousness into the circle of light. In an instant, he saw a vast and boundless world reflected in his mind. This world was so vast that even when Luo Fan tried to sense it with his mind, he had an indescribable feeling that it was difficult to wrap around it. After all, this world had almost become one with him, and all the changes in it should not be able to escape his senses. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how vast this world was. Compared to the world that he had expanded before, the current world seemed to be much larger and more vast. Moreover, in this world, in addition to the various strange beasts that originally existed, creatures that looked like connate Taoist bodies were gradually being born. Although Luo Fan had only left this world for a short period of time, this world had already developed for hundreds of millions of years due to the unimaginable flow of time. During this period of time, the creatures that looked like connate Taoist bodies had almost covered every piece of land in this world, including the island. A primitive and crude civilization began to evolve in that world. Luo Fan did not know if it was an illusion, but he vaguely felt that there was an additional aura that belonged to the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure in this entire world. Or rather, to be more precise, there was an additional aura that belonged to a Buddha in this entire world. It was as if at the last moment, when the Buddha suddenly pressed the level 9 pseudo-sage treasure into this world, its aura had already been completely poured into this world. Is it completely integrated? Luo Fan sensed this change and recalled what the Buddha had done at the last moment. He could not help but reveal a somewhat puzzled expression on his face. It's indeed an inheritance. He was quite understanding of such a change. After all, this was an inheritance that belonged to the Buddha. As a supreme level, 9 pseudo-sage existence, the Buddha had even fallen at the last moment of becoming a sage due to a coincidence. One could imagine how unwilling he was. Even under such circumstances, he was able to be open-minded enough to pass down the opportunity to become a sage so that many cultivators of the younger generation would have the opportunity to obtain his inheritance. It was possible to obtain this opportunity, but how could he really not care about his existence? How could he really not leave traces of his existence behind? At this moment, only these auras appeared in the light circle and in that world. This could already be considered extremely open-minded by the Buddha. If Luo Fan had done it himself, he might have found a way to keep a trace of his spirit so that he could be reborn in the future. This is an open scheme. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He instantly grasped the aura of the Buddha Supreme in this world and couldn't help but have an epiphany. The aura came from the grade 9 pseudo-sacred treasure. The reason why these auras had tainted the entire world was because of this. It was because the Buddha had completely shattered the level 9 pseudo-holy treasure and integrated every tiny detail of it into the world, becoming resources for the growth of the world. This made the world stronger, more stable, and more mysterious because of the level 9 pseudo-holy treasure. If Luo Fan didn't want this aura, then there was only one way. That was to expel all the power of this grade 9 pseudo-saint artifact. At that time, this world and the halo would probably degenerate to the state when Luo Fan had just passed the 3rd round of the test. Compared to now, it would be countless times worse. This was an open conspiracy. If you want this power, you have to leave behind my aura. If you don't want my aura, you can't have this power. You can choose what you want, Luo Fan sighed, but he didn't expel the aura. Although he wasn't very satisfied with the additional aura, it wasn't to the point where he wanted to expel it. The Buddha Supreme had given him a lot of benefits. In fact, in less than 10 years, he had directly advanced from the grade 1 pseudo-sacred peak to the grade 3 pseudo-sacred peak. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a kindness that could be easily ignored. However, Luo Fan wasn't angry just because the Buddha Supreme had left a bit of the Buddha Supreme's aura in the treasure that he had given him. After understanding this, Luo Fan shifted his attention. How does this world give cultivators a chance to become sages? With this thought in mind, Luo Fan attached his mind to the halo and began to spread his senses using the characteristics of the halo. He carefully sensed the entire demon realm that he was in. The moment he sensed the demon realm with the help of the halo, he discovered the fundamental difference between the demon realm and the primeval world. When he had first entered the third round of the test, which was the primeval world, he had felt that the primeval world was like the demon realm when the world had just been created. Everything there seemed to be no difference from the demon realm. He had even come to this island in the primeval world to confirm whether it was the demon realm or not. However, at this moment, when he sensed the demon realm through the halo, he discovered that the difference between the primeval world and the demon realm was huge. Back then, he had mistaken the primeval world for the demon realm. How wrong he'd been. On the surface, the demon realm was similar to the demon realm. It was also a layer of laws that were integrated with the great Tao of this world. It was like the layer of laws was the great Tao, and the great Tao was the layer of laws. Furthermore, both of these worlds were equally vast and boundless. Even their auras felt extremely similar at first glance. However, after experiencing it personally, Luo Fan discovered that the demon realm was more complicated than the primeval world. It was even more mysterious. The auras of the endless cultivators were completely intertwined with the aura of this world, adding millions of subtle and mysterious changes to this world. This was the superficial difference. Apart from this superficial difference, the deeper difference was that the great Tao of this world was completely different from the great Tao of the primeval world. After sensing for a few days, Luo Fan discovered this fundamental difference. He could not help but be shocked. He vaguely felt that this difference might be the fundamental reason why this primeval world could give people the opportunity to become a saint. He had completely eliminated all other distractions and completely focused his attention on the great Tao of the demon realm. Although the great Tao of the demon realm had completely integrated with the layer of laws, it was still a great Tao, and it still existed. It might be difficult to simply sense the great Tao of the entire demon realm. However, it was not impossible. At the very least, for Luo Fan at this moment, if he wanted to sense the great path of the devil realm, he only needed to move his heart, and he could easily sense the existence of the great path, as if he was looking at the lines on his palm. He could directly see the great path of the devil realm turn into an ordinary river flowing in front of his eyes. The great Tao of the demon realm was pure. It was so vast that it was beyond everyone's imagination. Even though Luo Fan had seen countless great Tao of heaven and earth, he was indescribably shocked when he saw this great Tao with his own eyes. The Tao Master Realm was said to be able to condense and materialize the great Tao above the real great Tao of heaven and earth, becoming the supreme great Tao and infinitely close to the saint realm. It was infinitely close to the power of the divine sense of a saint. However, that kind of surpassing and that kind of proximity did not mean that the great Tao condensed by oneself had truly surpassed the great Tao of heaven and earth, and that kind of divine sense of a saint was only roughly close. Compared to a fake saint, that kind of proximity was not enough at all. In fact, this was very natural. Every level of cognition had its own limits. Before becoming an innate Grand Luo to a cultivator, an innate Grand Luo was only a step away from the saint realm and was qualified to pursue the saint realm. After becoming an innate Grand Luo, a cultivator would realize that an innate Grand Luo wanted to become a saint. Only by becoming a quasi-life realm could one be considered to be close to becoming a saint. Similarly, after becoming a quasi-saint, one would realize that the Tao Master Realm was the closest to becoming a saint. After becoming a Tao Master Realm, one would also feel that there was a realm above this that was so huge that it was enough to make one despair, standing between them and becoming a saint. Based on this principle, perhaps even a level 9 pseudo Saint would realize that after stepping on the ninth step below the Saint realm. In fact, the Saint realm was still extremely high up in the sky, waiting for him to climb and cross over. In other words, although the Tao Master realm was said to have condensed a great Tao above the great Tao of heaven and earth, even a pseudo-saint would not dare to say that the great Tao they condensed and materialized could completely surpass the great Tao of heaven and earth. Therefore, although Luo Fan was already a level 3 pseudo-saint, and the great Tao he condensed and materialized was already above the great Tao of heaven and earth, and was not restricted by the great Tao, he was still inexplicably shocked by the great Tao of the demon realm. With a thought, another supreme great Tao appeared in Luo Fan's eyes. When the two great Tao were placed side by side, the shock was doubled, causing Luo Fan to take a deep breath to suppress the shock. The great Tao that appeared behind was none other than the great Tao of the primordial world inside the light circle. It was also the great Tao that Luo Fan suspected looked like when the demon realm was first established. When the two great Taos were placed together, the difference between the two was clear at a glance. It allowed Luo Fan to see the difference between the two great Taos in an incomparably direct manner. The great Tao was complex and vast, and the number of mysteries contained in it was beyond the limit of description. If an ordinary person saw this great Tao at a glance, it would be impossible for him to comprehend anything from it. Instead, because of the complexity of the great Tao, he would not be able to bear the impact of the information in it. His mind would directly collapse, and he would directly become a walking corpse. In such a vast and complicated great Tao, even if Luo Fan intuitively discovered the difference between the two great Tao, it was impossible for him to completely sort out these differences so easily, and it was even more impossible for him to instantly come to a fundamental conclusion about the reason for the appearance of this difference. What he could do now was to calm down and experience every bit of the mystery of the difference between the two great Tao bit by bit. He quietly comprehended the changes that this difference brought to the demon realm, and then through countless experiences and understanding of the difference, he would find a reason for this change. This was an extremely complicated process. Even if Luo Fan could see these two great Tao directly now, it would definitely not be a process that could be completed in a short period of time if he wanted to truly comprehend these mysteries. Time passed second by second as he continued to comprehend. Before he knew it, another 10 years had passed. During these 10 years, Luo Fan sat at the bow of the wooden ship with his eyes closed. His aura was withdrawn, and he did not reveal any aura or presence at all. Behind him, the world within the transparent circle of light was developing at an unimaginable speed. 10 years compared to that world seemed to be tens of billions of years. During these tens of billions of years, all sorts of strange civilizations had arisen and destroyed countless beings with born Taoism aptitudes in that world. Perhaps it was because the Buddha's aura had contaminated the primitive world, or perhaps it was the characteristics of the primitive world itself. In short, among the various civilizations that have been born and destroyed countless times by beings with born Taoism aptitudes, civilizations that belonged to Buddhism and Taoism occupied the majority. Even now, the civilization that occupied the majority of the entire world civilization was still that of Buddhism and Taoism. Chapter 1311. During these 10 years, Luo Fan had searched for countless differences between the two great Tao. Today, he had finally sorted out some of them. So that's how it is. After sorting out the information, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable sense of loss and indescribable shock. The sense of loss and shock was because of the source of the difference. It was because he had discovered that if the two great Tao were to be divided in detail, there would be countless differences, causing the two great Tao to be completely different. However, if he were to really trace back to the source, the most fundamental difference between the two great Tao was actually only 54 types. That's right, the most fundamental difference between the two great Tao was that the number of sages in the demon realm was the same. This was obviously not a coincidence. Therefore, in an instant, Luo Fan knew that it was the 54 sages that had caused such an unbelievable difference between the great Tao of the demon realm and the great Tao of the primitive world. This had caused the demon realm to become the demon realm it was today, and not the primitive world of the past. Why did the sages change the great Tao, and how did they change it? If one thought about it boldly, it was easy to guess that the final result of a cultivator becoming a sage would definitely be such a change in the great Tao. Could it be that this opportunity is to change the great Tao? Luo Fan looked at the two great Tao in front of him, and such a thought surged in his mind. However, he quickly dispelled this thought from his mind. This might be a result of a cultivator becoming a sage, but it was definitely not the direct reason. Becoming a sage was definitely not that simple. For a cultivator, it might not be possible to change the great Tao at the innate Grand Luo realm, but it was no longer impossible when a cultivator's realm was raised to the quasi-sage realm. Even if a cultivator at this level needed to spend a huge amount of energy and countless years to prepare to change the great Tao, it was still possible after all. In fact, if a cultivator was raised to the pseudo-sage realm, it would be even easier for them to change the great Tao. For example, the great Tao that Luo Fan had materialized was already above the great Tao of the heaven and earth. Although it was only out of his control, with the existence of the great Tao that he materialized, it would only take a single thought for him to influence and change the great Tao of the heaven and earth. He only needed to rely on the resonance between the great Taos. Naturally, it could change the great Tao of heaven and earth. Obviously, the change in the great Tao was not the direct reason for becoming a saint. Since the opportunity passed down by the Buddhist Supreme dared to claim that it could give one a chance to become a saint, it meant that the opportunity was definitely not that simple. It would not just give people the opportunity to change the great Tao. There must be a deeper level of change, and there must be a deeper level of mystery within. But now, Luo Fan discovered that the total number of changes to the Grand Tao had already reached his limit. He wanted to follow these changes to find out what had caused these changes, and how the existence that caused these changes allowed cultivators to become sages. That was obviously beyond the scope of his strength. Understanding this, Luo Fan sighed. He slowly dispersed the two great Taos in front of him. It seems like it's about time, he thought to himself as he slowly stood up. At this moment, the power of the rune structure on his body had already risen to an unimaginable level. It had completely covered up the special characteristics that he had after becoming flawless. It would no longer allow others to form a level 3 pseudo-sage imprint that belonged to him in the depths of their souls the moment they saw him. This situation had only happened in the past 1 or 2 years. In the past 1 or 2 years, the flawless characteristics of Luo Fan could not be completely covered up at all. This caused many living beings around him to form a level 3 pseudo-sage imprint that belonged to Luo Fan in the depths of their souls. Fortunately, most of these living beings were created by Luo Fan with the use of the law of cause and effect. There were no living beings that were truly strong enough to threaten him. Therefore, it did not affect him too much. It could only be regarded as a rare opportunity for many other living beings to cultivate. It was also because of the changes in the rune structure that Luo Fan was able to comprehend the difference between the two great Taos. He could sense the development of the situation on the entire island, which allowed him to wake up in time. In fact, after more than 20 years, the integration of the Ling Nation had begun. At this time, it had already come to an end. Now, almost the majority of living beings on the entire island had already recognized themselves as belonging to the Ling Nation. The original numerous countries on the entire island had also gradually integrated into the Ling Nation. The emperors and subjects of those countries had gradually changed the traditions that had lasted for a long time, and gradually got used to being a part of the great Ling Nation. In Luo Fan's senses, the emperor of the Ling Nation had already decided to hold a sacrificial ceremony in a few days to announce to the world and the heavens that this island had been completely unified. The Ling Nation had become the only nation on this island that had only appeared a few times in the billions of years since ancient times. Obviously, according to the news that he had learned from sect Master Xianwen of the Azure Temple. When the Emperor of the Ling Nation worshipped the heavens and announced to the heavens that the Ling Nation had unified the entire island, it was obviously the time when the test of an unknown sage would descend. At that time, this island would face the attack of an island that was exactly the same as this island. At that time, Luo Fan would also encounter the attack of a cultivator that was exactly the same as him, like his clone. At this time, although Luo Fan no longer needed to use such pressure to break through the bottleneck of level one pseudo-sage, he still did not change his original plan. He did not stop the Ling Nation from truly unifying the entire island, nor did he think of a way to avoid a battle with his clone. The reason for this was very simple, because this matter had already become a burden in his heart. If he avoided the battle at this time, it would definitely have some impact on his mind. Although it would not affect the improvement of his cultivation in the future, it would increase his fear of the sage. It would further reduce his chances of becoming a sage in the future. Even if that chance was already extremely small, there was still hope after all. Letting Luo Fan add some dangers to himself at this time because of the small hope, and instead reduce the hope once again, he was naturally unwilling to do so. This was also the reason why Luo Fan was unwilling to change his plan at this time, even if he no longer needed to use the same battle with himself to stimulate himself and break through the bottleneck of the peak level one pseudo-saint and become a level 2 pseudo-saint. After a few days, suddenly, there was a thunderclap in the sky. Then, a loud voice suddenly sounded from a certain location on this island. The voice was ordinary when it first appeared, but the more it sounded, the stronger the terrifying power contained in the voice became. In the end, it even shook the heavens and the earth, making it seem as if this voice was the only thing left in the entire world. In the past, I was ordered by the heavens to be a ruler. On behalf of the heavens, I supported Qian Li, Iluinyu, well rope, and I have inherited it to this day. The people have many blessings, and I will not forget to repay them. This funeral oration was simple and desolate, as if it had been passed down from an endless period of time. It was as if the voices of countless emperors of the Ling Kingdom were mixed together and resounded through the heavens and the earth, causing all living beings who heard this to involuntarily feel a sense of awe and holiness that emanated from the bottom of their hearts. Amidst this funeral oration, the thunderclap in the sky became louder and louder, and the originally cloudless sky suddenly began to condense and accumulate traces of black fog out of nowhere. This black fog, it became thicker and thicker. At first, it was just black fog, but when the funeral oration was about to end, the black fog had condensed into a boundless dark cloud that completely covered the vast sky above the island. This dark cloud was so huge that under its cover, the entire world seemed to be completely covered. At this moment, every place on this island seemed to have fallen into the deepest layer of the night. Unless one could see things without light, no one could see anything, not even their own fingers. This strange change was like the entire island and everything above and below it. At this moment, it was completely devoured by some unbelievable existence. This kind of change was a shocking upheaval for all the creatures on the island who were not mentally prepared. It caused them to suddenly feel an inexplicable sense of panic. It was as if a calamity was right in front of them, but they still did not know what kind of calamity it was. They did not know what kind of inconceivable thing had happened to cause such a terrifying scene to appear at this moment. For the Ling Kingdom's emperor and the other living beings and cultivators who already knew what was going to happen, this change was so obvious that they finally confirmed that the ancient legend was actually true. It let them know what kind of tragic battle they were about to encounter. Compared to other living beings, Luo Fan had been comprehending the great Tao of the demon realm for the past 10 years. At this moment, he had a much closer understanding of the demon realm than before, and he saw many more things than other cultivators and living beings. In his eyes, the dark clouds in the sky were not dark clouds at all, but a space-time, a world. That space-time, that world did not exist in a normal way. Instead, it was like building blocks that were being built according to the island, bit by bit, piece by piece. He could even see that in that space-time, the earth was taking shape, the mountains were rising, the valleys were sinking, the rivers were opening up, and the grassland was beginning to flourish. These were considered normal for Luo Fan. Even if it was him, he could easily create these things. Even though the level of perfect replication might not be comparable to the world above, there wouldn't be too much of a difference in essence. What shocked Luo Fan was the endless living beings that were being born and being formed above. Whether it was the emperor or the beggar, whether it was the rich merchant or the official, whether it was the frail scholar who didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken, or the powerful martial artist who could tear tigers and leopards apart, or even the powerful cultivators who could live forever, or even the one that gradually appeared in the center of the island. An existence that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with, another Luo Fan. After the other Luo Fan appeared, he also looked up at the sky. Even his expression was the same as Luo Fan's at this moment, as if Luo Fan was looking at a mirror. The means of a sage. Is this the means of a sage? Luo Fan only had this thought in his mind as he looked at the incredible changes that were happening above his head. It was extremely easy for Luo Fan to open up a world and create living beings. In fact, he could even create countless worlds with just a raise of his hand or a move of his foot. He could create billions of living beings. However, to create a cultivator, to create a false sacred realm cultivator, was impossible for him. Given Luo Fan's strength, he could really create a pseudo-sage treasure that was half a step away from being a pseudo-sage. He could only do it not long ago, when he had just comprehended the second level of the law of karma. Not to mention pseudo-sage beings. However, at this moment, all living beings appeared in the sky at the same time. The way and speed of the clone of Luo Fan appeared. It was exactly the same as the way and speed of the ants up there. From the looks of it, it was as if Luo Fan and that ant were on the same level of existence. Luo Fan obviously could not understand such a change at all. Although he had seen the entire process clearly, when all the changes were finally completed, he realized that he could not understand a single thing at all. What did he think about the appearance of the island before he saw it? Right now, he was still thinking the same thing. He still had the same idea of what mysteries were contained in that change. He didn't have a deeper understanding just because he had seen the whole process clearly. In such a situation, he could only lament that this was the means of a sage. There's the law of karma. There's the great Tao. There are countless things that can't be described or classified. He thought to himself, and a wry smile gradually appeared on his face. The speed at which the world in the sky was being constructed was beyond imagination. When the island emperor's sacrificial rites sounded, it gradually appeared. However, when the hundreds of words of sacrificial rites disappeared completely, the world in the sky was already formed. A world that completely replicated everything on the island had been formed. The moment the world was formed, the dark clouds in the sky trembled slightly and dissipated into thin air. The moment the dark clouds dissipated, everyone on the island suddenly understood that they were no longer in the original world. They had entered a trial that belonged to a sage. This trial was incomparably difficult. What they needed to do was to defeat an island that was exactly the same as theirs, a creature that was exactly the same as all of them. As long as they passed this trial, they would be qualified to go to the center of the world, to the 4 continents, and become a disciple of one of the 54 sages in the world. From then on, they would have a future that was millions of times brighter than what they had now. They might even have the opportunity to receive teaching from a sage in the future. However, if they were unable to pass this trial, then what awaited them was death. They had only appeared a few times since ancient times. The unification of the island would collapse once more, and the world would return to its original state of chaos. Of course, this might not have anything to do with them by then, because their souls might have been destroyed in this trial, never to be reincarnated. It's finally here. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. At this moment, the dark clouds above had already disappeared, and the world that was exactly the same as this island that was revealed in the dark clouds had also disappeared. However, Luo Fan clearly knew that that world had not disappeared. Instead, the entire island that he was on had entered that world, and that island was currently not far away from this island, preparing for a battle of life and death with this island. At this moment, a strange prayer was transmitted into Luo Fan's ears through a mysterious connection. When Luo Fan heard this, he knew that it was the Ling Nation's emperor, the god of heaven, and the others asking him what he should do. With a thought, Luo Fan took a step forward, and his figure disappeared from this ordinary-looking wooden ship. When he reappeared, he had already traversed the long void and appeared directly on the capital of this island, which was also the capital of the Ling Nation. Of course, this was no longer the capital of the Ling Nation when it was just a small country at the border. This was a place that was neither too far nor too close to the center of the island. Looking down at the capital, Luo Fan discovered that not only was the entire capital huge, but it was also vast beyond imagination. Moreover, the entire capital was so prosperous that even he could not help but exclaim in admiration. Compared to the current capital, the former capital of the Ling Nation was like a small mountain village with only a few families. Unfortunately, at this time, the entire capital was shrouded in an extremely ominous atmosphere. To be more specific, it was an extremely depressing and despairing atmosphere. Chapter 13:12. Luo Fan did not conceal his arrival. As soon as he arrived above the capital, hundreds of senses scanned his location. Of course, even though Luo Fan did not conceal his arrival, with Luo Fan's power, these cultivators could not see him clearly. Even if their perception swept over the place where Luo Fan was, what they finally saw was only an incomparably powerful ball of light. The brightness of this light was enough to stun any cultivator. Some cultivators, due to their insufficient cultivation base, were blinded by the terrifying light the moment they scanned Luo Fan. It took them a lot of effort to recover. When they saw Luo Fan clearly, the entire capital lined up in a solemn procession at an unimaginable speed. At this moment, the entire capital completely lost its original depressing and despairing atmosphere. Instead, it was replaced with hope and an inexplicable sense of joy. Tens of thousands of cultivators rose from the capital and formed a long, radiant path in the air that exuded boundless nobility and majesty. It extended all the way to where Luo Fan was. Next, the heavenly gods, the sacred beings, and the others followed the Ling Kingdom's emperor and quickly arrived before Luo Fan. Even the Ling Kingdom's emperor, who was the spokesperson of the island during the worship ceremony and ruled over billions of lives on the island, was extremely obedient at this moment. He directly bowed to Luo Fan. After a great show of extravagance, the Ling Kingdom's emperor finally invited Luo Fan to the palace. Luo Fan looked at this extravagance that could move ordinary people to tears, but he only showed a faint smile on his face. He was not affected at all by this extravagance. Of course, he could not be bothered to stop them either. He only watched quietly. When the Ling Kingdom's emperor asked Luo Fan to go to the palace for a discussion, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Forget about going to the palace. You asked me to come this time to ask how we should deal with the upcoming matters, right?" "That is indeed so," the heavenly deity and the others said in unison. Although the status of the Ling Kingdom's emperor was different in Luo Fan's heart, the position of the Ling Kingdom's emperor was far inferior to that of the heaven gods and the others who had some kinship with him. That was exactly why, even though the emperor of the Ling Kingdom had become the emperor of the entire island, among these people, his status was the lowest. When it came to proper business, it was naturally not his turn. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "I already know about this matter. With the current situation, that's what I wanted." Hearing Luo Fan's words, everyone's expression changed. Such a fact. They had already guessed it, but after all, they still had some wishful thinking in their hearts. Now that Luo Fan directly asked this question, they finally confirmed this point, but for a moment, they did not know how they should feel about it. At this time, They already knew what kind of dangerous situation the entire island was about to encounter. It was very likely that all the living beings on the island would be completely wiped out in the near future. Even for them, it was very likely that their bodies and Tao would vanish and their souls would scatter. From then on, their existences would be completely erased. Under such circumstances, of course, they could not be happy about the current situation. However, at the same time, the great existence in front of them took the initiative to create such a situation. It was unlikely that he was going to send them to their deaths. He must have made arrangements, and there must be a way for them to survive this danger. This gave them an inexplicable sense of hope amidst the pressure. There was even an indescribable sense of anticipation. If the existence before them really had a way, could it be that he could allow the island to obtain great benefits under such circumstances? All these emotions intertwined together, causing their expressions to become a little strange. How intelligent was Luo Fan? He could see through their thoughts at a glance, but he was too lazy to care about them. He smiled and said, "In this sage trial, you will encounter an attack from an island that is exactly the same as this island. If you can defeat that island, you will be qualified to join the sage's army, and from then on, you will be able to fight for the sage. Although the danger will be greatly increased, you will also obtain indescribable opportunities and great benefits. If you can't defeat that island, everything will be over. It is very likely that all the living beings on this island will be completely wiped out, and all the cultivators will be killed. What should we do? Please give us some pointers, Immortal." The heaven deity said carefully. He already knew about these things. As soon as Luo Fan said it, he naturally understood it completely, and there was no need for him to continue explaining. However, what he wanted to know was how to do it. "What do you think about joining the sage's army?" Luo Fan smiled faintly. "Although joining the sage's army will allow you to obtain greater opportunities, because the opponent is also a sage's army, I think the danger will be greater. Selfishly speaking, I think it's better not to join." The heaven deity said, "What about you?" Luo Fan smiled faintly and asked the others. The others looked at each other. Their views were similar to the heaven deities. They also felt that joining the sage's army was too dangerous, and they were also unwilling to do so. The reason was very simple. They were very clear about their own capabilities. On this small island, they could still do whatever they wanted, but on the 4 central continents of this world, under the sage's army, they would definitely become cannon fodder. As for cannon fodder, how could they, who were extremely familiar with war, not know what kind of fate it was? That's right, opportunities did exist. Those cannon fodder could indeed allow them to obtain endless benefits under the effect of some amazing luck. They could be promoted and become rich, or obtain some treasures, or even raise their cultivation realm to an extremely high peak. However, among the 10,000 cannon fodder, there might not even be one who would obtain such an opportunity. These people had such self-awareness, so how could they be so arrogant as to think that they were less than 1 in 10,000? Everyone could clearly see each other's thoughts, and for a moment, they all heaved a sigh of relief. Then, the divine and the others all bowed to Luo Fan and said, "We all think so too." Luo Fan looked at them and nodded, saying, "Since you have no intention of joining the sage's army, then it's simple. Apart from those who are willing to go to the island with me to challenge the clone, everyone else will stay on this island. When the 2 armies clash, just directly surrender." Surrender? These words caused everyone's expressions to change. After a long while, only then did they come to a sudden realization. It turned out that it was that simple. Although the sage's trial was dangerous, it obviously did not aim to exterminate all of them. In such a situation, this trial, naturally, it did not need to kill all of them to be considered a failure. And it did not need to kill all of them. Then, it could be decided by one side, surrendering as the condition of victory. Since it was decided by one side, surrendering as the condition of victory, admitting defeat after being beaten to a half-crippled state or admitting defeat without even fighting at all would also determine the outcome of the battle. What was the difference in the outcome? Under such circumstances, as long as they were not willing to join the sages, They could directly face the enemy and admit defeat before they suffered any damage. This was clearly the best choice. There were so many of them, but the reason they hadn't thought of this before was because they were stuck in a dead end. In other words, it was because the supreme prestige of the sage had brought them a strong and unparalleled spiritual pressure, blinding their minds. During this process, they did not even think about the possibility of directly giving up. Instead, they painstakingly completed the trial of the sage and wholeheartedly wanted to pass this trial. The possibility of directly surrendering had been subconsciously eliminated from their minds from the very beginning. Hearing Luo Fan say such a simple solution to the problem, everyone couldn't help but smile. The despair and fear that had been lingering in their hearts had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. In an instant, the atmosphere had become relaxed. All right, since you've understood, then I'll give you 3 days. 3 days later, I'm willing to challenge the island. Those who are willing to duplicate themselves, come to the lake in the center of the island to meet me. Luo Fan said calmly. After saying that, he couldn't be bothered with them. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In an instant, he had traveled tens of thousands of miles and arrived at the center of the lake where he had stayed for a long time. He appeared directly at the bow of the wooden boat. He didn't explain too much and only stated his arrangements. However, he believed that all of them should know what he meant and what he wanted to do. If there were actually cultivators who couldn't understand what he meant from his words, then their countless years of cultivation would have all been in vain. As for why he said it to be 3 days later, it was because he knew that it would take at least 3 days for the news to spread and for them to gather at the center of the lake. By then, Luo Fan didn't care how many cultivators would come. In any case, he had let those cultivators go to the island with him because he was giving them a chance. It was a blessing that he spread. Whether they went or not was up to them. After all, 3 days was something that Luo Fan could afford to lose. In this trial space, time flowed many times faster than the outside world. With such a fast flow of time, it was obvious that this trial would take a long time to complete. In such a long time, Luo Fan still had the patience to spend 3 days spreading his blessings. As for whether the other island would send an army to attack this island and start the real trial, Luo Fan wasn't worried at all. Mobilizing the power of an island, even if it was the power of a duplicate island, was definitely not a simple matter. Let alone 3 days. Even if it took them 3 years to truly mobilize and attack this island, Luo Fan would still praise them for being fast and efficient enough. During these 3 days, Luo Fan had been quietly sitting and adjusting his breathing. As for the many cultivators who received Luo Fan's words, they fell into a bitter torment. Just as Luo Fan thought, almost all the cultivators understood Luo Fan's meaning and what Luo Fan wanted to do. They also knew that Luo Fan was giving them an indescribable blessing. However, not every single one of them was willing to accept this opportunity and fortune. Fighting against a clone that was exactly the same as him was simply throwing away half of his life. His chances of survival were very low. It was almost 50% to Luo Fan, who had absolute confidence in himself. Such a huge chance of death was naturally nothing. However, to the many other cultivators, it was enough to make them retreat. In the end, in Chapter 1322, everything was the same. It almost made people suspect that Luo Fan had just circled around and returned to the island. Is this the island? Apart from Luo Fan, this was the first time all the cultivators saw the duplicate island. Previously, the island was constructed among the dark clouds in the void. However, apart from Luo Fan, who could see through the dark clouds and clearly see the process of the island's construction, no one else could see it at all. To them, when the Ling Nation's emperor's sacrificial rites sounded, the dark clouds filled the sky. When the sacrificial rites ended, the dark clouds dissipated, and everyone knew that they had to participate in a terrifying trial. Even a heavenly god had a look of disbelief when he saw the island. It's really exactly the same, he murmured, and a bitter smile gradually appeared on his face. The more he cultivated and the stronger he became, the more he realized how weak he was, and the more he realized how long the path ahead of him was. To him, everything on the island in front of him was completely different from the island he had stayed on for so long. If he didn't know that Luo Fan wouldn't lie to them, he would definitely think this was the island. However, the entire island only appeared for a short period of time after the sacrificial rites sounded. What kind of unbelievable power was that? And what kind of shocking mystery was contained within it? All of this was a riddle to him, and he couldn't even imagine it. Therefore, how could he not feel bitter? Even a heavenly god was in such a state, and the highest cultivation level of the others was only on par with him. Their performance was even more obvious, and they looked even more pathetic. They were almost out of their wits. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about them. He didn't stop anywhere on the island. Instead, he headed straight for the center of the island, where the lake was. In other words, he headed straight for the place where his clone embodiment was waiting. There was no need to elaborate on his speed. Almost as soon as everyone finished sighing, he had already traversed more than half of the island in the span of a few dozen breaths. Ignoring all the burdens, he arrived at the lake, where he saw the wooden boat in the distance. He saw an extremely familiar, yet somewhat strange, existence standing quietly on the wooden boat. One was also a flawless third-level pseudo-saint, also had his own unique worldview, also grasped the second level of the law of causality, also had the memory of 3 perfect worlds, and was also a great existence from the age of chaos, the other Luo Fan. When the two of them met, a faint smile suddenly appeared on the other Luo Fan's face, and he said, "You really took the initiative to come." When Luo Fan heard this extremely familiar voice saying these words that didn't come from his mouth, he suddenly had an inexplicable strange feeling. He stopped and stayed in midair, facing the other Luo Fan from afar, and said, "Although you aren't me, you came from the means of a sage. I think your clone of me is deep enough. It's only normal that you can guess what I'm thinking. If you can't guess it, then I'll have to doubt the quality of this sage trial. Not bad, not bad. I feel very lucky to be able to become your clone. Thanks to you, I know that the chaotic state is so exciting." The other Luo Fan said. As soon as he said this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. Although this person was completely copied according to him, and at the moment of birth, he was indeed exactly the same as him, he was not the real him. At the moment he was born, he was already fundamentally different from him, and had become a completely different person. It was just that this person had his memory, his cultivation, and the power of his magical powers. And when this person said that, Luo Fan also knew what he was referring to. He was obviously referring to all kinds of information about the Primordial world, the Great Tianyuan world, and even the Great Jili world. You must be relieved now. You feel that I'm not you, so you feel less psychological burden. You feel that killing me next will not bring you any psychological pressure, right? The other Luo Fan said with a smile. Indeed, Luo Fan didn't deny it.